Welcome to Organic Connections Online, and thank you for joining us. My name is Marla Carlson, and I'm president of Organic Connections and will be moderating today's session. I'm speaking to you today from Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, situated on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. These are the territories of the Nahiwak, the Anishinaabeg, the Dakota, the Lakota, and the Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Chief Nation. Today, these lands continue to be shared territory of many diverse peoples from near and far. I'm just going to start the day off telling you a little bit about Organic Connections. We're a nonprofit organization established to hold conferences and trade shows for the prairie organic industry. We celebrate organic food and farmers through activities that connect and educate. Our first conference took place in 2004, and there's been a conference every 2 years since then. And in addition to our conferences, we hold an event for students called Planting Seeds, and it happens every year in the fall, where we host up to 100 grade 5 and 6 students at the Science Center in Regina. The students are guided through a number of stations where they plant a seed, learn about nutrition, explore the complex worlds of bees and pollination, and have an organic snack prepared by a local chef. In 2018, we hosted our largest conference yet with over 500 participants, 70 exhibitors in 18,000 square feet of trade show space. Some of our sponsors have been with us from the beginning, their support growing right alongside us with the conference itself. We thank all of our sponsors for your support. Without you and the farmers who come back to the conference year after year, Organic Connections would not be possible. After the success of our 2018 conference, we started planning, increasing our trade show capacity and working on a marketing plan to increase attendance. But COVID-19 had a different plan for us in 2020. So here we are with an amazing lineup of speakers over 2 days, physically distanced, connected through fiber optic cables and Wi-Fi. This year, we won't be able to share stories, ideas, or what did or didn't work on the farm over organic meals. But it will sure make November 2021 all the more sweeter when we are able to gather again in Saskatoon. And a big thank you, as I mentioned in my intro, a big thank you to our sponsors. You can see they've come in and supported us in a big way in a tough year, and we really appreciate that. And now our program for today. So right away, quick here, we're going to get started with Bob Quinn, followed by Don Huber, and then Chris Trump will be talking with us, and then rounding out the morning with Andy Hammermeister from the Organic Agricultural Centre of Canada. So probably enough from me for now, and I always like to make up a few minutes at the beginning of the day because we always seem to push it a little bit as we go through the morning. So without further ado, I am going to introduce to you our next speaker, who our presenting sponsor is PHS Organics, and we'd like to thank you, PHS Organics, for that. So PHS Organics is excited to have Bob Quinn speak to Saskatchewan producers so producers can understand why PHS has so much respect for Bob and his work. The grain Bob founded, the Kamut brand, is a beneficial product of Saskatchewan and Alberta, and the Kamut program is for the benefit of organic producers. PHS Organics has acres available for 2021, so please give them a call if you're interested in growing Kamut. And now on to introducing Bob Quinn. So Bob Quinn grew up on a farm in Montana after receiving a PhD in plant biochemistry. He returned to the farm in the late 70s. Bob started Montana Flour and Grains Inc., and in 1986, that company introduced to the natural food industry an ancient grain similar to durum wheat. The grain was grown only organically and marketed under its own brand name, Kamut. Bob continues to promote organic and sustainable agriculture, locally produced food and fuel, as well as promoting the idea that food should be our medicine and medicine should be our food. We're pleased to have Bob join us today speaking on taking farming back to the future for health, prosperity, and fun. Over to you, Bob.
But I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all, and look forward to being together with you in person the next conference. So I've really enjoyed the conferences I've attended in the past and know that I will enjoy it in the future. And appreciate the opportunity at least to be able to do this much when we are really confined way past any expectations of being so. So anyway, as you already heard, my name is Bob Quinn. I was raised on a 2,400 wheat and cattle ranch near Big Sandy, Montana, which is where you see the small star there on the map of Montana. We're located directly south of the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, about 75 miles. The farm was started by my grandfather, Emmett Quinn, in 1920. And so this year we celebrated our 100th anniversary of that event. Although that got postponed too because of the epidemic underway. So my father actually took over the farm in 1948, and he was raised there. I was raised there, and now I have raised my family here because I returned to the farm after being in college for 10 years. I studied botany and plant pathology at Montana State and plant biochemistry at UC Davis. And I ended up in California starting a small business. I was a little disheartened with academia after 10 years of being involved with it, and decided to bail out. And finally, I ended up coming back to the farm. And in my whole farm, in a very short time, became my laboratory. I continued my interest in plant science and research, and continued doing that. But one problem we found when we got back to the farm, that it was a little bit small for two families. My folks were still there. I didn't want to go to town to get a job. I didn't want to send my wife to get it to town either. We both had more than we could do running the farm or helping my folks run the farm. And buying out the neighbors wasn't an option. Besides, I'd like my neighbors anyway. I didn't really want to buy them out. So after a couple of years of trying a few different things, none of which were successful, I started Montana Flour and Grains with a distant cousin of mine who lived in Southern California. The idea that we had was to sell our grain, high protein wheat, directly to whole grain bakers in Southern California. We found one customer in the fall of 1983, and we were in business. He started taking a truckload of wheat a week, and paid us $1 a bushel premium for that. And that was when prices were about $3 a bushel. That was an increase of 33%, which was a boon to the farm. It really helped us. And when we didn't have enough grain or good enough of quality, I found it's my job to find grain that fit the customer's needs. So that's how we kept the business going. I had a big surprise from my customer, and just after the first year, he called me and he said, "Hey, Bob," he said, "do you think you can find some organic wheat, this similar quality you've been sending us?" And I said, "Oh, sure." Hung up the phone, and then I thought to myself, man, now what am I going to do? I don't even know any organic farmers. In fact, I really didn't even believe in organic agriculture. I had been taught all my life through high school, through university, that a plant couldn't tell the difference between a molecule of nitrogen coming out of a manure pile and one from a bag of ammonium sulfate or other chemical fertilizer. So I had my doubts, but I didn't let those dissuade me from giving the customer what they wanted. So I went looking for organic farmers, and I found one in the northeast corner of Montana, and went up and got some grain from him, sent to California, and our customer loved it. He said, "Wow, this is great, I'll take some more." And so then I had to go find some more organic farmers. There weren't too many in the early 80s, but I soon met most of them and got acquainted, and we became friends, and they started inviting me to some of their meetings. I was surprised, I was astounded, I should say, by what I heard. They talked about being able to walk over their fields and feel the tilth of the soil had improving. They talked about raising their own fertilizer using legumes, so they could eliminate the need for buying chemical fertilizers. They could break up cycles of weeds and diseases and insects using rotations of various crops, and eliminate the need for chemical pesticide inputs. They were able to reduce the cost of their inputs, increase the value of what they sold, and generally improve the bottom line of their farm. And all of them told me, matter-of-factly, that it has made farming a lot more fun. I was very intrigued about this report, and I couldn't really wait to get home and try it out for myself. My dad thought it was a little bit risky, but I talked him into an experiment of 20 acres. And the first year, that was an astounding success. We planted it right next to 20 acres of chemical farming that we were doing as usual. It was winter wheat, and at harvest time, both crops were within 1 or 2 bushel in yield, one like 35 and 37 or so. The proteins were both high. One was 15.3, one was 15, organic was 15.5. I was ecstatic. My father was astounded. He had been paying out tens of thousands of dollars a year for inputs, and here this whippersnapper of a young son of his had come back from California and done the same thing without any of that expense. I said, Dad, we need to do the whole farm this way. Let's convert 50%. He said, whoa. He said, how about 10? And I said, well, how about 20? So we converted 20% the next year. And that year we had a drought. And with droughts, normally in Montana, we get grasshoppers. We sure did this year. And in 1988, we had a terrible infestation of grasshoppers. And I was very concerned. I called up my organic friends. I said, what do you do for grasshoppers? And they said, oh, don't worry. It's just Nosema locusta. It's a protozoa, a little smaller than bacterium. And you put it on wheat bran, spread it around your fields, and the grasshoppers eat that. Then they get sick, and then they eat each other. And the disease spreads through the whole group of grasshoppers. It's kind of like politics in America today. And that worked very, very well. Even though they ate in about 20 feet into the field, at harvest time, there's very few grasshoppers in the combine tank. Meanwhile, with my non-organic chemical fields, I had the spray planes come out and spray malathion, and that killed everything instantly. But in about 10 days or so, the malathion dissipated and the grasshoppers came back. I couldn't afford to spray a second time. So I just let it go, and at harvest time, I had about as many grasshoppers in the combine tank as I had crane. I was convinced at that point. I had done everything that modern science told me to do, and it had failed. And my organic system was a success. For 2 times in a row, it equaled or surpassed chemical agriculture on our farm. And I told my dad then I was ready to go cold turkey and quit chemicals. And he was supportive. And so we did that. That was over about 33 years ago. And we haven't used a chemical input since on our farm. We haven't used any inputs. And it's been a trial and error, but very exciting to me. I found out that everything I've been told by my friends of reducing inputs and increasing the value of outputs was true. And it was certainly true that I was having more fun. So I really became almost an instant convert, and have tried to promote the idea of regenerative organic agriculture all over Montana, all over the country, all over the world. And I'm a very passionate believer in that. Of course, there's been lots of trials and errors over the last 30 years or so. We're still learning. We're still evolving our practices and dealing with such things as perennial weeds. We haven't got that all solved yet. Climate change, of course, is a challenge, and the changing markets are always a challenge to keep up with. About the same time that I converted to organic, we introduced to the market, we started going to food shows, and we introduced to the market an ancient grain that we sold under the trademark of Kamut, which our family registered. And the registration of a trademark doesn't mean that we own the grain. I think the grain is a gift from the good Lord in the first place. But if they want to have certain guarantees, we use the trademark to make sure those guarantees are met. And our guarantees are, first of all, it's organically grown. It's 100% organic ancient Corson wheat. It's not been mixed with any modern wheat or crossed with any modern wheat. It has to be high in protein and free of disease. And also we have to, anyone who uses the trademark has to tell the truth about it. And claims that they make need to be supported by research. We assured the farmers that we worked with that they would have a market and a fair price. We did not follow the traditional industrial model of extracting as much as possible out of the farmer to by paying them as little as possible, and then selling it to buyers as cheap as possible, but agreed on fair prices to the farmers and the manufacturers alike. We did not have suppliers and customers, we had partners. And that's the way we work together. We all work together for the betterment of the whole program and for everybody. And when things went well, we shared in the benefits together. And when we met challenges, we all worked together to solve the problems. our motto was everybody wins, and that's how we built the business. The promotion of this grain and experiments with growing it all over the world have taken me almost to every continent, and where I've cooperated and met organic farmers, and really have seen that regenerative organic can be successful all over the world. The program with the Kamut, however, was really the success, I should say, was due to the taste of the grain and the high quality we maintained, and the fact that most people who could not eat the modern wheat could eat this grain without difficulty. To help us understand the reasons for this observation, we sponsored over 15 years worth of research, which has resulted in the publication of 35 journal articles in highly regarded peer-reviewed journals, scientific journals. We compared the effects of modern wheat on the body to the effects of ancient wheat using volunteers and clinical trials. We studied many different chronic diseases such as heart disease, irritable bowel syndrome, diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome, fibromyalgia. And in every case, even though the studies were not involving hundreds of people, they involved 20 to 50 or so. They were controlled into two groups. One group ate one diet, the other another diet, and then there's a washout period, and then the two groups switched so that they each were exposed to both diets. So it had internal controls, which made the study very, very strong. Every single case was very, very consistent. In every case, we saw antioxidant capacity increase, cholesterol, blood sugar, insulin, and insulin resistance decreased, magnesium, zinc, and calcium in the blood increased. But the biggest difference was the effect on inflammatory properties. We saw a 20 or a 30 to 45% increase in markers for anti-inflammatory properties in the blood. And so, while ancient grain was highly anti-inflammatory, the modern wheat was slightly inflammatory. And this, since inflammation is tied to all chronic disease, this is a very important finding for health and for the future of health, and tying it to nutrition. And it really opened my understanding about the importance of the types of food that we eat, because it's not just focused on just this grain. Many other foods also, I believe, can have similar effects. And I've become a strong believer in the teachings of Hippocrates, who 2,300 years ago taught that food should be our medicine, and medicine should be our food. So I knew I wouldn't have time in just a half hour or so to tell the whole story this morning, so I wrote a book. And the book is called Grain by Grain. My co-author is Liz Carlisle. And then you'll find many of the details of the stories that I've had to skip over this morning. So I hope you'll enjoy it. Because of my experience over the last 35 years, I now spend my time really warning people of the high cost of cheap food. So most of the cost of food that we buy is not paid at the checkout counter of our local grocery stores. It's paid by farmers, first of all, who are forced to take low prices for what they grow, which hardly gives them enough to pay the cost of the chemical inputs they're buying. This contributes to many of them going out of business and leaving the farm. With the loss of farmers, the second cost we see is the decline of rural communities. Our little town of Big Sandy, for example, has gone from about 1,000, which it had when I was in high school in the early 60s, to about 600 population today. And that's typical of what we see across the rural countryside. The third cause is chemical pollution of our land, our water, and our air. We've found glyphosate in the rain, which falls on our farm. We have dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, the size of New Jersey. We have well water in Iowa so contaminated with nitrates it is unfit to drink. And finally, and most seriously, the fourth cost we see is the loss of our health and constant rise in chronic disease. And most of this problem is tied to poor nutritional density of our food, which is a result of an industrial model we've been following, and to make it cheap and to make it plentiful. So my question is, how far can we go down this road before we really see what's going on? In true cost accounting, it's very much like the iceberg, where 90% of the ice is really hidden beneath the surface of the water, and is out of sight. It's this hidden portion that sinks the ships. And it's the hidden portion in the cost of cheap food that will sink us and lead to increasing damage that we're starting to see all around us. So this brings me finally to my thoughts and subject for today that I'd like to visit with you about. I think it is now the right time to take farming back to the future for the sake of our health, our prosperity, and our enjoyment of our lives as being farmers. And by saying that, I'm not suggesting that we give up all the progress that we have made in understanding the biology and of crop production or adoption of tools to make production easier and more efficient. I'm not saying we should go back to horse and the plow, by no means at all. But what I am calling for is a change in the direction of the industrial chemical model, which is based first of all on extracting as much wealth from our farmers and rural communities as possible to sell as cheaply as possible in the marketplace and to be sure that we have the most abundant, high-yielding crops possible. This current system takes no responsibility for any of the problems that they have created, and I just outlined here a few minutes ago. But rather, their battle cry is, we have to feed the world. How often have you heard that? Biotech is necessary to feed the world. And this is just a kind of a replay of underlying theme of better living through chemistry, which we heard preached to us, at least when I was growing up in an earlier generation. So I think we need, what we really need to do as growers is think about what we're doing. The ag industrial chemical complex would have us think about only growing commodities, producing commodities, focusing on yields, so that our goal is to produce as much as possible to be bought and sold in the commodity trading markets, and to extract as much of the wealth out of the rural economy as possible. This is based on a system of agriculture which focuses on feeding the plants with inputs. Every artificial chemical compound imaginable, which not only feeds the plants, but then protects the fast-growing plants, now under stress because they're artificially growing faster than normal. This weakens them and makes them more vulnerable for diseases, weeds, and insects, which then requires more chemical inputs to protect them from those troubles. So it's a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cost cycle. And the cost of these inputs is so large that the agrochemical company, at least in the United States, has made sure that farmers can pay for all these inputs. And so they make sure that there's a government program with extra money, subsidies coming to farmers. In the early 80s, before we converted to organic, regenerative organic agriculture, our government payments were about $25,000 to $26,000 a year for our 1,200 acres of crop that we had in at that time. And guess what our input costs were? Our costs for fertilizers, herbicides, and whatnot were almost identical, $24,000 to $25,000 per year. So the government checks that we were getting really weren't for us. They were using our checkbook to transfer from the federal treasury large amount, billions of dollars, through farmer checkbooks to chemical companies throughout the country. And that's how it worked. Farmers could never afford these inputs without these kind of subsidies. And that's how they were promoted, at least in the United States. Wonder now if we focused on nutrients, growing nutrients per acre, rather than bushels or tons per acre, and then being paid accordingly, being paid premiums for more nutrition, rather than just taking the bottom dollar, the least amount possible for more tons. I tell whoever wants to listen to me that on my farm we do not grow a single commodity. I only grow food, good food, nutritious food, which contributes to the health and vitality of all those who eat it. And because I'm certified organic, I receive a premium for this. And because I farm in a regenerative organic way and grow all my own inputs, I do not pay the expense of buying these inputs. Or I also do not contribute to the cost of cleaning up the pollution caused by these inputs. The result is a better financial position for my farm, a better life, and better food for my family. We eat the food that we grow on our farm. So it's very important to me that it's good and it's nutritious. So when I speak of taking farming back to the future, I'm speaking of returning it to its original purpose, to provide health and nourishment to those who depend on it for good food. So in the last 35 years, we've gone from about zero organic sales in the marketplace to nearly 6% in the U.S. at least. And so the question is, why can't we finish the job in the next 35 years and go from 6% to organic? Why not? If we just continue at the current growth rate, it almost will happen by itself. But maintain the current growth rate will not happen by itself. We must have really a change in thinking by the majority of the people in the countries, and that's starting to happen. But here's some suggestions that I put together that might help with that. Most of the change will have to come through education, and I think marketing, and people making better choices. As the powers that are in control of governments will certainly never permit change through legislation at this time. And know that I don't think that it's always best to force change through legislation, but I think if we help change evolve, it will be more consistent and people will adopt it because they want to adopt it. So we have to educate and enlighten buyers who are willing then to vote with their food dollars every time they go to the store. So one way to promote education is an understanding of the need to pay more for food is connect the cost of food and the cost of sickness or disease. And never consider the one without the other because they are connected. Since World War II, the sum of those two costs have been nearly 30% in most household budgets. 70 years ago, about 1/3 of what we pay out of that 30% went to healthcare, and 2/3 went to food. Today, those numbers are reversed. I'm suggesting by buying higher nutrient-dense food, the cost of healthcare would be reduced. And by being less sick, the savings we would experience from reduced costs of healthcare would more than pay for the increase in costs of the higher quality of food that we would be eating. This could be encouraged even further by doctors who would prescribe certain types of and quantities of food rather than pills for treatment of disease, but more importantly, for the prevention of disease. Wonder if we spent just as much time and money today on prevention of COVID by helping people to eat better and strengthen their immune systems as we are spending on developing a vaccine, which, if it is similar to recent flu vaccines, will produce only limited results and not at all address the root cause of the problem. The increase of purchases of nutrient-dense organic food would increase market demand and encourage more conversion of farms to organic production. To help farmers with this conversion, I would suggest a couple things. First of all, to change the direction of government-funded research. The percent of money dedicated to organic research at USDA here in the United States is about 1% of the total, while organic sales in the marketplace is about 6%. I don't know what it is in Canada. It'd be interesting to do the same comparison there. We are far behind reality here in America, which is pointing the way to the future. By its very nature, research should be a reflection of the future, and we're not even keeping up with the current situation, not to mention current trends leading to the future. Our federal commitment to organic research should at least equal or exceed the current percent of organic food sold in the marketplace. You know, it would be just like going back 120 years or so when the automobile was first coming onto the roads and showing that it could be a success, and yet government research would be at the same time spending 99% of their resources on perfecting the stagecoach. And this is what we're doing. We're focusing on perfecting a failed experiment. When people talk to me about conventional agriculture and they think they're talking about, you know, this industrial chemical model of growing food, I'd say to them, conventional, that's what we've been doing for the last 10,000 years. What we've been doing for the last 70 is an experiment using chemistry that is now the wheels are starting to come off of that bus. We have pollution, we have all the things I've mentioned. We have pollution, we have increasing illness, we have contamination of our food tainted with pesticides, and we have resistant weeds for herbicides. So we have lots of trouble with this stuff. It's not the right way to go. The other thing, secondly, I would help farmers suggested we would do, helping farmers with conversion and making sure that every government-funded farm advisor should have training in regenerative organic systems and be able to answer questions regarding it for their region. And finally, I would urge farmers not to jump from industrial chemical ag to industrial organic ag, which relies on organically approved inputs and focuses on plant health and increasing only yields. Therefore, inviting people to push down prices again and not see what's really important is the nutrition of the food that we're growing. I would rather suggest changing the focus on the soil health and regenerative organic systems, which start with seeds of high potential for nutrient-dense crops, the way we're doing with our Camus project. When those seeds produce crops in healthy soil, we have healthy plants, which will nourish all who eat them, and the final result will be a healthy population. Now, let me say a few words about our naysayers and those who badmouth us and say that we'll be responsible for starving the world. First of all, I'd like to debunk the idea that through technology, developed countries will feed the world. That's not possible. The statistics can't bear that out. Currently, approximately 3/4 of the world's population lives in what's considered underdeveloped countries. The developed countries produce about 1/3 of the world's food supply. The remaining 2/3, the vast majority, is produced by local small farmers in the region where it's consumed. Research studies coming out of Africa and India suggest that all farmers, most of whom cannot afford chemical inputs anyway, switch to regenerative organic techniques, they would increase their production by 2 or 3 times. This would be mostly due to introduction of crop rotations and growing crops which nourish the soil and have the idea of replenishing and regenerating the soil. This would supply enough food for generations to come. A second criticism we often hear is that organic food is so costly that only the rich can afford it. I would ask, well, how much does it cost to be sick? Can the rich only afford to be sick? But not to get off on that tangent, we're getting back to the question of food. We admit, sure, that it's true the cost of the food, as I suggested earlier, would be more, but the reduction in healthcare costs would more than pay for this increase and in price of the better food. And you're still concerned about those with little means to pay for more food, then I've got 3 suggestions to help you with your food bill. First of all, buy local and in season, and grow some of it yourself. Everybody can at least put a pot on their patio or maybe buy a south-facing window, and many have the opportunity to have access to community gardens or even a small backyard or a small front yard that you could grow food instead of grass. Buy less processed food and prepare some of your own meals from scratch. Prepare as much as home as possible. And don't waste any of your food. You know that 40 to 50% of food is wasted that's grown in the world. In undeveloped countries, most of that waste happens by food not being stored properly. But in developed countries, most of that waste occurs after it even gets to the store or is bought and sits in refrigerators as unused leftovers. They're just thrown out as uneaten because it was too much on the plate or whatever on the table. If we were to reduce that waste to zero, you could cut your food bill in half. So you could afford to spend twice as much for organic food, not waste any, and not be paying any more for the food than you are paying for the chemical food that you're buying and wasting half of it. So that's another way to think about solutions. In summary, let me say that regenerative organic production has many advantages. It will sequester huge amounts of carbon and help mediate climate change. It will bring health back to our farms and our farmers. It will bring also economic and spiritual and physical health back to our farms. And not only farms, but also our communities. It helps to heal our environment by reducing pollution and of all kinds. And also, and finally, and most importantly, it will bring health back to our people. So it is the future. It is possible. And if you're on this path, I invite you to keep up the good work and not be discouraged by challenges that have and will arise in the future, but join together with like-minded people to help each other and overcome these challenges. If you're not on this path, then I invite you to join with the thousands who are. It's the future. It's our best hope for sustaining it, and it's fun. So I thank you very much for your attention. I apologize for the little my disappearance there for a few minutes, but I want you to think. A lot of people think sometimes that the problems that we face in the world, and they think they're just so overwhelming that we can't do anything. Well, just as we add a little drop to a pond, each individually, if we each add our own little drop, the pond will grow. And finally, we'll create not only a little ripple that drop makes when it falls in the pond, but also a wave that will change the way we eat, the way we grow our food, and the way we live our lives. And that's my hope and my thought that I leave you with today. And now I'd be pleased to offer some time to answer questions or add to the discussion. Well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Bob. I think it was your presentation was a fantastic way to start off the morning, giving us that, or at least giving us some ideas or some thinking and talking points around, like, why are we doing this anyway? Like, why are we farming organic? We do a lot, especially at Sask Organics, on the how, to help folks improve soil health and yield and business practices and all those kinds of things. But I think sometimes it's really great just to bring us all back to the why. It's like, why are we doing this? And some of the things that I found really, really helpful in your presentation is reminding us that we're growing food, not commodities, that food is medicine, and really highlighting those, that what happens when we externalize all of the costs of this cheap food, right? What does that mean, not only to our physical self, but our communities, and our countries, and really all citizens in the world, because what we do here does impact everywhere else. If we do continue with this idea that we're feeding the world, when we're doing that, we're dumping grain somewhere else and probably displacing a local farmer in their own community. So sometimes I think it's really important to kind of bring us all back to those big picture sort of ideas and questions. And I think that coming from Montana and Saskatchewan, we have those big expanses and lots of time sometimes to ponder those thoughts. So it looks like I have a couple of questions have come in. Could you talk a little bit about the nutrient density of organic food, which reduces the volume needs?
Oh, it's reducing the volume? Is that what the question was?
Yeah. So that organic food being more nutrient dense. Yeah.
Yes. So one of the concerns, of course, on the cost of the food is that it does cost more. But the flip side of that is that you don't need to eat as much of it, so you don't need to buy as much, because it is it's generally more filling, and it has more nutrient density, such as increase in antioxidants that I mentioned, and polyphenols. It's been found in many organic crops that the polyphenols are increased, and those are very strong anti-inflammatory and antioxidant type promoting compounds. We also, in wheat, I should have mentioned this too, that we have what would you call it? The idea or the tradition of white flour. And when you make white flour, you're throwing away a third of the nutrition out of the wheat that was there to provide us good health in the first place. So we could reduce, or we could increase the amount of grain available in North America just by the snap of the finger, by everybody eating whole grain instead of white flour, and they would be much healthier. So that would add to the nutritional density. The bran really helps with the digestion and the flow of food through your intestines. The germ and the minerals and the vitamins and other components that are contained there, it's also a big benefit to your health. So particularly with wheat, it's not only the way we grow it, but sometimes it's the way we process it, that we have deteriorated the amount of nutrition that we start with. So there's two things, and you can do that with other foods too. You can process the life out of them. You can process to the point that that the nutrition is really reduced, and a lot of the some of the food scientists these days and the companies think, well, don't worry about that. We'll just add it all back. And so you artificially add things to fortify your food. That's done with flour all the time. White flour is fortified, but it's not the same as what you start with, and keeping it pure and healthy in the first place. So I think that not only the farm should be focused on for creating high nutrition, but the processor should be also focused on and held accountable for maintaining or enhancing that nutrition, not diminishing it.
All right, thank you. I have another question here. Bob, what do you think the top priority is for researchers to focus on?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, I think that depends on what region of the country you're at. In our region right now, I would like to see a focus on the control of perennial weeds. We're looking at some biological controls, but we haven't really been able to perfect those and make them widely available. I think that could be a great help to us. I think another area to focus on is proving the real strong connection between food and health. I think that if we connect food and health, it will be a real driver to the government deciding that maybe they should support and promote this type of agriculture and this type of food production. Because if you look at healthcare and what's happening with chronic disease, no nation, and it doesn't matter what kind of healthcare system you have can have the best that you can imagine, but no nation can support having a significant portion of their population chronically ill. It doesn't matter what kind of healthcare system you have, it's going to break the country that has it, and it'll destroy the society. So I think that that's a very important thing. That's kind of a secondary need for research. Back to the farm, though, I think the other thing that we really need to continue to understand is soil health and what to do about it. You know, there's a lot of, with regenerative organic agriculture and just some regenerative by itself, there's a big cry for no-till. Well, on the prairies, and you know this as well across the border as one side or the other, we haven't really got no-till figured out to, at least I haven't been able to get it figured out on my place, and I've tried lots of different experiments. I've tried the things that are working in the east and in other places, the crimpers, and they don't work successfully here for us as well. And I think that if we could figure out more how to mimic nature, nature is certainly no-till, but the closer we can get to that, I think the better off we are. But it's going to take some more research of figuring out what can be done. And some experts, and I don't know if Dr. Huber will mention this, but I've read statements that he thinks that tillage once in a while is a benefit. And so I don't think we need to be caught up in a dogma that says all tillage all the time is bad. That maybe we need tillage once in a while, but we can certainly avoid exposing the soil to wind and water erosion that we've seen plague us in the past. And we've already seen a big reduction of that on our farm just when we went to the type of regenerative organic agriculture we're doing with growing our green manures and then incorporating those back into the soil, increasing the organic matter and holding the soil together with that. So those are just a couple of the topics that I would like to see go to the top of the research agenda.
Yeah, I think that tillage one is really interesting and important, especially with all of the, you know, what I like to talk about, like there's this regenerative agricultural narrative out there, as well as regenerative agriculture agronomic practices, which are two very, you know, very different things, you know, for me. And one of my concerns around this kind of like movement towards, you know, no-till is the ideal, is that, you know, kind of picking up on something you said earlier in the conversation around, you know, just kind of mimicking non-organic agriculture, right? So looking for biological controls that are created off-farm to be able to control weeds or control whatever it is that you're trying to control when you're going no-till, right? And so I think there's some I don't know exactly what, but there's something in that we need to also be mindful of when we're looking at how to sort of embrace no-till or min-till on organic farms, if our goal is to, not bring inputs off farm onto the farm. That's just
I think that should be our ultimate goal, and we are on the prairies might be more easily able to do that because we're only growing one crop every other year or two for cash crops, and so on our off year we can grow green manures for part of the season. We wanted to. I've been trying to experiment with cover crops through the season, but this year the grasshoppers ate up all my cover crops. So the first experiment I had in mind to do that by growing certain cover crops with winter wheat seeded early in the season. Of course, we worry about disease then when you do that, but we were experimenting with cover crops that would die during the winter and then leave only the winter wheat to come through the winter and then be the only crop growing in the spring. Of course, the further north we go, I know you have less winter wheat, but with climate change, that line is also moving north. So people just right next to the border, our spring wheat, winter wheat line is moving. It's moving towards you guys in Saskatchewan and in Alberta more. So I think that we should also be experimenting with new cropping systems and new ideas as climate change really starts to have more effect on how we grow stuff.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And just a little plug for tomorrow's program. We have the Crabtrees from Villicus Farms doing a presentation for us called Defending the Plow. So we'll some good information around, I guess, the benefits of maintaining some tillage on the farm. So I have another question here for you. What do you think of the new regenerative organic certification program?
Ah, that's a good question.
That's a big one too.
Yeah. I haven't signed up completely. I have been involved with some of the development of it. I think it's really a good idea to lay out in very specific ways some of the things that were part of the organic movement and the philosophy and the spirit of organic that didn't get put into our national organic program, at least. And now we've been fighting over some of the things that we thought were already settled, like confinement, animal confinement, and access to pasture, and all those kinds of things that that we had no intention that be introduced, so that we have industrial organic agriculture almost mimicking industrial chemical agriculture. So those parts I think are really, really good. I'm a little frustrated that in some cases we don't get credit, like in the western upper Great Plains area. We can grow all of our own inputs, and we don't get a lot of credit for that, but we get dinged pretty hard for still summer following or cultivating and green manuring and using cultivation. And I think that if we're going to get dinged for something we haven't got figured out yet, that's not quite. I don't like that too well, but I think we should get credit for what we have been able to figure out that maybe other people haven't been able to figure out, so that there's a little more of a balance across the board. But I really think they have a lot of good ideas. It's going in the right direction. Maybe it'll be a driver for national organic programs. I hate to see too many certificates and labels springing up everywhere, because that's what we tried to do with national programs when we had state labels that were different in every way you can think of. So I think that there's two edges to it, but I think the pluses outweigh the minuses.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that for me, one of the things something new does is create a little push, right?
Yes.
To what's already existing, and I always think of getting your organic certificate isn't a destination, it's a journey, right? So and so how do we ensure, because we are I think we are largely monocropping, and we have to think about that a little bit. And we have some great rotations, and now with the green manures and intercropping. So we're, like you said, we're figuring things out. And for me, one of the things as somebody who works for organic industry association. It's like, how do we talk about that more? How do we talk about how we're doing the regenerative organic practices on our farms, and being honest about what we're figuring out, and how we're going about figuring it out, right? So,
Right.
not to, and I think there will always be that next high bar thing. And as you said, there's good and, the double-edged sword, but in the end, it pushes everybody to be better. And I think that can't be a bad thing.
Yes. I think that when you mentioned intercropping and monoculture, that should go on really high on the list of the research ideas too, because that's something that we really haven't generally got figured out. There's been some experiments with people growing companion crops, and especially cocktails of cover crops, which are really good, but we haven't really made a lot of progress in that. When I was on the first National Organic Standards Board here in the U.S., and I was shocked as we developed through our first recommendations that the USDA had no intention of allowing the program to evolve very much. So what we decided on became both a ceiling and a floor to the organic requirements or the criteria for certification. When we had many certifications, it was a little bit like the Wild West, but the positive thing was that everybody was always trying to outdo the other and pushing the envelope a little bit in improving the organic requirements for certification. As we learned more how to do it and adapted and found better practices, that has really slowed down a lot. And it's due to the certification being so much almost poured in cement that it's hard to evolve and hard to change it and hard to improve it. So that's one thing that we have lost with government programs that are reluctant to change very much.
All right. Yeah, no, I agree. And we have a little bit of a different system here in Canada in terms of how we review our standards. And there's, at least with my limited knowledge of how you do it in the US, we seem to have a little bit more input into that process. So I think these are all good things. We've just reviewed our standard, and the new one will be published in this month actually. But we have 5 years to work on what we want to see included in the next one. So I don't think it's ever too early to start thinking about those things.
Well, good for you. And be involved. Be involved. I tell all of our listeners to be involved. You can be part of the solution. So be involved.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one last question before we let you go. Do you have a thought on gluten sensitivity versus chemical sensitivity in grains?
That's a really good question. So with people that have, I kind of group it all together as wheat sensitivities. If you have a wheat sensitivity, at least in the US, and I'm sure in Canada it's not much different, almost 20% of the population is falling into this group now that is having some kind of sensitivity when they eat wheat. 1% is gluten intolerance, which is celiac disease, and for some people that's life and death. So we don't encourage those people to be too experimental. But if you're not in the 1% and not life and death, but in the 20% that's sensitive only, with various problems such as bloating or constipation or diarrhea or whatever, aches and pains, then there's some things that you can try. There's certainly, first of all, I encourage people, there's 4 things you can do. You can eat only heirloom and ancient wheats for one thing, and we talked about that, and also eat wheat that's only grown organically. And then you get to the question of how much of the problem is created by chemical, the chemical load on our wheat, particularly glyphosate. Glyphosate is an antibiotic, and it works that way by shutting down certain chemical pathways that exist in plants. They don't exist in humans, so it was touted to be safe for humans, but it does shut down those pathways that exist in bacteria, and we're full of bacteria. We have more bacteria in our gut than we have in our human cells, and so if you start disrupting that, you're going to cause trouble that are expressed in all kinds of different ways. And that's why it's hard to pinpoint, because every individual is different and it will affect them differently. So we don't even know the % of trouble is caused by glyphosate-tainted grain. And now on our research that we did, mostly in Italy, we used only organic grains, both organic and non ancient wheat and modern wheat. Both of them were organically grown. So we didn't have the question of glyphosate residues even hopefully was completely eliminated in our research. So we didn't study that. But another study that looked at that would be very, very interesting. I know that some work has been done in Canada to demonstrate that, and I think more needs to be done. The other thing that you can do if you have wheat sensitivities, I mentioned already, to eat whole grain flour and wheat products instead of white. And the final thing is to eat sourdough. When you eat sourdough, the fermentation is breaking down gluten. In 36 hours, you can break down almost 90% or more of the gluten in grain. Most fermentations don't go that long, but even if you go 24 hours or even overnight, you're starting to break down starch and protein complexes that pre-digest what you're going to eat and make the digestion process much, much easier. So there's many facets to this problem, and they are all contributing. So if you have a serious problem, I would try all four of those and see at once and see if it doesn't help you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bob. That brings us to the end of your time and our first presentation. And I'd really just like to thank you on behalf of Organic Connections and all of those who are viewing today to thank you for your time and information. And I really feel like it was just the right combination of affirmation and challenge. And I think that's a good thing, and to remind us that to find a little joy as well in what we do. And boy, we need that right about now. So
yes,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we would like to thank TCO Cert for being a gold sponsor and the sponsor of this particular session. So thank you so much, TCO Cert. And now it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce Dr. Don Huber. He is a professor emeritus of plant pathology at Purdue University. He holds a bachelor and master's degree of science from the University of Idaho and a PhD from Michigan State University. Don is also a graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and National Security Program. He is author and co-author of 300 journal articles, experiment station bulletins, book chapters, and review articles, 3 books, and 84 special invited publications, and an active scientific reviewer, speaker, consultant to academia, industry, and government, and international research cooperator. So we are so very pleased to have Dr. Don Huber with us this morning, and he's going to be talking about managing nutrition to control plant diseases and pests. So over to you, Don.
Hey, thanks, Carla. Okay, the objective of farming is really capturing the sun's energy and storing it as sugar, as you can see in this schematic. That we do this through a process called photosynthesis, and then with nitrogen fixation, taking nitrogen from the air, we also use that nitrogen, or the plant uses it, to make proteins and amino acids. But in order for this process to work, it requires some specific minerals. We have manganese that splits the water so that we have the hydrogen that combines with carbon dioxide from the air to form that sugar. The oxygen then goes to the atmosphere, which we can breathe, and that's where we get our oxygen. If it wasn't for photosynthesis, we'd be in tough shape. Wouldn't be here very long. Requires manganese again to split that water to provide the hydrogen for photosynthesis for sugar and oxygen for us. But also you have magnesium as the metalloprotein and that chloroplast, so that it can catch the sun's energy and use it to drive this process. But then all 17 elements that are essential for plant growth are all involved in this really marvelous process that we call plant growth, and that's where we get our food and nutrition. So that we can look at that process from a biochemical or a physiological interaction process, but when we're farming, we're really managing the ecology so that we can have all of those nutrients available for those physiological processes that are involved in this wonderful factory that we call a plant. Now that ecology consists of the plant as the factory, the physical environment providing the base source of the resources for the process to work, and then a very important biological environment that provides a lot of the reactions that are involved there. It's involved in nutrient absorption, nutrient availability, because those organisms make those physical entities available for plant uptake. And of course, then we also have that component that's the pathogen and pests that come into play. Usually when something else isn't working effectively, that we see those. So that when we're farming, we're really managing all four components of this ecology in order to provide the nutrients that are needed to make this whole process work. And you can see the source of those nutrients. We have air and water and soil. It's all involved. A lot of our soils may not have all of those nutrients present that are essential for plant growth, and they needed to be added. On the Kankakee River Valley, across Illinois and Indiana, over into Ohio, we have very low manganese availability in those soils. In those soils, it's a matter of manganese being tied up more than it is an absence of manganese. And so it's a matter of managing the biology that's that bottom component in that diamond that I presented earlier. In other situations, it may be an absence of manganese from the soil to start with, just as we might have a deficiency of sulfur or very often nitrogen and those materials that we need to add and get from some other source. You can't bleed blood from a turnip. So that those nutrients need to be added, but we need all 17 of those in a sufficient level for the plant function efficiently. Then there are four elements, as you can see, that are beneficial elements that make those other elements, the essential elements, more efficient and more effective. Now, these nutrients are components of plant parts, as well as the activators, inhibitors, and regulators of the physiological processes. I've likened the regulatory aspect here kind of like the key. We have very powerful enzymes in the plant that can do a lot of work for us, kind of like having a 400 horsepower engine in your tractor or that, but it doesn't do any work until you turn the key on. It's these nutrients, and especially the micronutrients and some of the macronutrients also, that are the cofactors for those enzymes, or the keys that turn them on. So in order to shut down a particular program or physiological process, we merely pull the key out of the ignition, and we can do that biologically with certain organisms, or all of our herbicides and pesticides are generally nutrient chelators. In other words, they grab onto that essential nutrient that should be fit in the keyway, and they change its physical characteristics so that it's no longer functional, and we shut down certain pathways. Now that can be done from an organic standpoint through allelopathy. We see that it hasn't been developed effectively, but it could be developed. It's one of those research areas that Bob indicated that needs to be really worked on effectively for weed control, for natural weed control. We see it occurring all the time in climax ecosystems, so we know it can be done. But we have a lot of tools that we can use in managing this ecology. One thing to remember is that you can't change one thing without changing all four of the interactions in that diamond that we refer to as the ecology. But all of these tools then have an effect on nutrition and its availability and function for the plant. And I'll get into a lot of those, and these are all tools that we can use to improve that nutritional status of the plant and improve our yields. And sometimes it's the environment that's involved that we need to change or to modify so that specific nutrients become more available, more accessible to the plant. And you can see in this slide just the effect of pH is a very dynamic aspect or influence on nutrient availability. Nutrient may be present in the soil. Our soil test says that we have plenty of it there, but the plant isn't able to access it because it's not in an available form. And it may be a simple matter of just changing the pH a little bit to make that nutrient available rather than the necessity to necessarily apply it. Now, if we're going to haul it off and sell it, all of those nutrients in a crop all the time, then it's a finite limit that we have in the plant. And at some point in time, we need to address recycling or the addition of particular nutrients, especially the micronutrients that we haven't paid much attention to in the past, that we've been mining the soil, and those are a lot of the elements that we need to really address a lot more now.
Don, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt just for a second and ask you if you could turn your webcam on.
I can if I can find it.
I think we're going to send you a request, and then you should just be able to click on it.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt. You can keep going now, I think, while we're...
I thought if I can maybe cover it up. If I'm a distraction, I better cover it up.
Yeah, no, we'd love to see you. But if not, we'll just continue. We'll continue on. That works too.
If that'll work. Does that help?
Absolutely.
When I don't see a note from you.
Okay. We'll just continue on. Thanks, Don. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. When we see a disease, the symptom of a disease, it very often is a symptom of a nutrient deficiency because the diseases are influencing that nutrient uptake or the physiological processes that nutrient is involved in. The pictures that you see down at the bottom there are with citrus variegated chlorosis. One of the first symptoms that you see is a severe deficiency of manganese and zinc. Well, the bacterium is plugging up the xylem so that those nutrients aren't able to be transported to the vegetative tissues above ground. And one of the first things that we looked at in controlling that disease in Brazil initially, and we see the same thing in Florida and Arizona and California with similar types of diseases, vascular occlusion, that if we'll address the need of the plant for those nutrients, we can control that disease very easily. And I'll show you how we did that biologically in Brazil very effectively. But you see all of these diseases, and when you see that symptom of the disease, it tells you right off that what you have is a nutrient deficiency. Doesn't always tell you exactly how, but it tells you that that disease is limiting those specific nutrients that are required by the plant for its efficient use. So our approach then in managing this ecology is to make sure that we have all of these environments that are and conditions, all four of those components that are favorable to the plant and not favorable to the pathogen or pest or disease organism that might be involved here. And if we'll keep that in mind, that this is what we're doing. We're focusing on the plant and its efficiency, its ability to utilize those nutrients, and we find that the pests and diseases then become less significant or non-significant in our production. It means that we also need to have a balanced nutrition. That pickup may be able to run on 3 cylinders, but it does a whole lot better if it's 4 or 5 or 6 rather than 5. So we're looking at balanced nutrition. Often that's a matter of looking at the roots, and the roots may be the root of the problem, especially with our soil-borne diseases that aren't quite as obvious for us. Some of the implications of nutrition and disease have been established over years of just observing what happens when that nutrient's applied. We can also analyze plant tissue levels of resistant and susceptible plants, or disease, non-diseased plants, or even just look at the environmental conditions that influence the availability of specific nutrients, and also see how all 4 of these are very, very common expressions of the effect of a particular nutrient on disease. So that in that upper slide here, you can see the effect on verticillium wilt of ammonium, where we see a marked reduction in severity of this disease in 2 to 3 weeks. Longer tuber formation and yield potential by just using an ammonium source of nitrogen in comparison to a nitrate source, which changes the soil biology in both cases, that would provide either more ammonium or higher nitrate nitrogen source for the plant. You can see it with other diseases. In the bottom is where we have a manured versus a non-manured field of winter wheat. You can see coming out in the spring on the non-manured, very severe winter kill from Rhizoctonia cerealis, a cold temperature snow mold type of a disease. Well, in that manured, we can reproduce that same effect of the manure by making sure that we have a full sufficiency of zinc available that is available through the manure, or we can apply it with other sources if we get it out pre-plant to maintain the resistance of the wheat through that long winter dormant period. No single nutrient will control all diseases, so that they all can increase certain ones if they're out of balance, or if they're deficient, we'll see a benefit then in getting the sufficiency up. But all diseases are reported to have an effect either on increasing or decreasing a disease, in spite of what you'll read in some of the textbooks. They'll say, well, potassium controls all diseases, or nitrogen, or some other nutrient. They all interact together to influence that effect. And so you can go into the textbooks and sources, and you'll find tables that will show what specific nutrients would be important to address for various diseases. In this table, it's primarily showing the influence of magnesium on these diseases, either those diseases that are increased or decreased. And this may be, when you're looking at the literature, they don't always tell you whether that's effect is from an excess or a deficiency. Generally from a deficiency that we would see this type of a response. There's another table for sulfur, and you can go through and find tables with all of these, all of the essential nutrients and beneficial nutrients, and as they correlate with specific diseases, because those diseases are related to specific physiological processes that can be impaired by the various deficiencies that the pathogen might induce. We can also look at just the environmental conditions that would influence the availability of particular diseases. In this table, you see all of those cultural practices that inhibit nitrification. This would be a natural climax ecosystem environment where the climax plant inhibits nitrification as a nitrogen conservation means. But when you have inhibited nitrification or an ammoniacal source of nitrogen, you also have an increase in manganese, because that stimulates the reducing organisms that make manganese more available for the plant. And the end result is that you see a decreased severity in potato scab and rice blast, cake all, or phytotoxicum root rot, cornstalk rot, a number of other diseases when you have this particular environment. We can reproduce it through form of nitrogen or changing pH, a number of different ways that you can do this. You can see all of the factors that would decrease nitrification and increase manganese uptake. And you look at those factors, and it would have an opposite effect on this. And you see another list of conditions that will increase nitrification and decrease manganese availability, and in consequence is that we increase potato scab and rice blast and those other diseases. So if we look at the overall system, then we need to understand our disease and the influence that those particular particular nutrients would have on it. In 2007, 3 of us got together to edit a book to kind of boil down or provide some of that information in a more readily accessible form. And the American Phytopathological Society published that book. It's Mineral Nutrition and Plant Disease. It's undergoing an updating process right now, so that by the first of the year, I would anticipate that a new edition of that would be out. It's been a bestseller, but a lot of those tables are available in that and in other sources. But there are essentially 6 keys to using nutrition to reduce and control our diseases. I've listed those here, and I'll take some time and just briefly review each of them as we go on through the process. Certainly the genetics of the plant, its base resistance or susceptibility, its ability to utilize the nutrients, all come into play here. And perhaps the most important thing that a farmer does really is selecting that variety and that seed that he's going to plant. You can see here in this upper slide on the left that rye, which is very efficient for nutrient uptake, is quite resistant to the take-all disease, which is very severe in this particular location in southwestern Indiana. compared to the wheat. If you pulled up a wheat plant out of this soil, you'd see 50% of those roots are non-functional. They're black from the root and crown rot caused by a soil-borne fungus we refer to as Leishmaniasis. But it's the take-all disease. But the rye does very well because it's very efficient in taking up the micronutrients in comparison to wheat, and it's able to maintain its resistance. So as soon as the fungus penetrates the epidermis, the rye immediately physiologically produces a callus around that fungus so that it can't develop any further and do any damage. If you look at the soybeans in the bottom, in all of our varieties, there's a tremendous range of nutrient efficiencies. Plant breeders can do a lot from a disease standpoint by just selecting those varieties or that germplasm that has the ability to take up those nutrients and use them efficiently. You see here with soybean variety on the left, very manganese efficient in its uptake and physiological function. The one on the right is inefficient. Now, if you put those two varieties down at the Purdue Agronomy Farm, very rich soil, probably the richest soil nutrient-wise in the state, and they both yield equally well. Both of them very acceptable varieties, but you put them up on the Kankakee River Valley soils up in northwestern Indiana, and you find that one of them just bombs out, that poor manganese or manganese inefficient one. Also, when we disrupt the integrity of the genetic code through genetic engineering, one of the things that we see and find is that there's generally a reduced nutrient efficiency that can be fairly pronounced or more limited, but anytime that genetic code is disrupted, this common effect is a reduced nutrient efficiency. In this Roundup Ready soybean variety, here you see that there's a 17% reduction in efficiency for manganese. You may not see that on a very rich soil, but you get on to manganese marginal soil and it becomes very pronounced then, affecting the plant all the way through, and especially also when you look at the reduction, 47% reduction in zinc uptake. And you say, well, does this explain a lot of our lower nutrient density in a lot of our food crops? And it does. And then you apply glyphosate to that Roundup Ready plant that was engineered just so that it could tolerate this poison. And you see, with the strong chelating ability of glyphosate for manganese and zinc and the other minerals, you see a further diminishing of availability of nutrients physiologically in the plant, but also through its antibiotic activity, the availability of some of those nutrients in the soil. So selection of seed is very important. The second key would be using the nitrogen nutrient farm, our availability then, which has a very profound effect on many diseases, so that we would want a nitrate source for if we had the fusarium wilts in our melons and other vegetables. Put a little calcium with that, with a nitrate source of nitrogen, and you have generally very practical, effective weed control. You can influence the nutrient farm through a previous plant or through companion crops or cover crops. As you can see in the slide here, the soybean, alfalfa, and corn, and pea, and that will increase the rate of nitrification. So you're going to have predominantly nitrate source of nitrogen, regardless of the source that you might apply, whether it be manure or whether it be an inorganic source, or you can utilize other plants, Brachiaria and Tracheopogon and conifers are all climax ecosystem plants that produce a natural nitrification inhibitor through their root exudates and modify the biology under those plants. Barley, which also has some reduction there, and there are other plants that we find in cover crop mixes and that will inhibit nitrification, or we can do it chemically in conventional agriculture. But the plants can utilize either form of nitrogen equally well, but the physiology takes place in different parts of the plant. So if you have a root pathogen versus a foliar pathogen, you may want that physiology with the ammonium nitrogen, where the physiology is primarily in the root system, and then the amino acids are translocated throughout the plant. But with another system, you also might want to have most of that metabolism for your nitrogen going on in the leaf tissues or foliar tissues, so that you don't provide the nutrients specifically for to enrich the pathogen. We're approaching it there. Either way, you can meet the needs of the plant without compromising or predisposing to the diseases. And so some of those diseases that are reduced by nitrate nitrogen, again, some tables here, are an alkaline pH, which favors nitrification, are listed here. We have another table for those that would be reduced by an ammoniacal source of nitrogen, or a more acid pH to suppress the nitrifying organisms and keep our nitrogen more in the more stable ammonium source. And just some practical examples of how that works is verticillium wilda on potatoes. Quite often in conventional agriculture, whether it's potatoes or cotton or other problems with verticillium, they'll go in and fumigate their soils. Well, this has a big effect on your whole soil biology, but one of those materials is talone. GD would be a similar one, and you see that we get generally fairly effective control of the verticillium wilt, even though the fungus may actually be increased in its population, because talone is an effective nitrification inhibitor, and we have the ammonium source of nitrogen. And you'll find that even in those situations where they're fumigating, if they'll use an ammonium source of nitrogen that's stabilized with the talone, they have higher yield and more effective control of the verticillium than they do with a nitrate, which actually reduces some of the benefit of the fumigant. You look at potato scab, where we've inhibited nitrification, and you can do that with some natural products or with some chemical compounds that are available to inhibit nitrification. On that 0 to 10 scale, anything above a 2 would essentially be ruled out for fresh market. And so you would take a deduction, as you see down with the nitrate nitrogen down there. Most of them are in that 4 and 5 category. So they're primarily for processing rather than for fresh market purposes when you get that severe disease. But through the form of nitrogen, you have big control on that. One of the problems we had in Indiana, getting our growers to use their manure responsibly is a gold mine for nutrients, was that they were approaching it as a disposal problem, and so they were adding high rates of manure and tying up their manganese and zinc, which are very critical for resistance of the corn plant to gibberella stalk rot and fusarium and a number of other diseases. So that when we showed them that if they would merely use those materials that would inhibit nitrification of that product, and we could do this with the pre-crop or with the companion crop also to inhibit nitrification rather than chemically do it with the nitropyrin here, but by focusing on the form of nitrogen that plant was going to be utilizing, we convinced them that they could utilize their manure much more efficiently and effectively and eliminate the predisposition to the stalk rot by merely managing these soil microorganisms. And it worked very well both for spring applied or for fall applied manure by inhibiting that nitrification, and also with the inorganic sources of fertilizer, just to demonstrate the effectiveness of that form of nitrogen approach. Both farms, again, being equally utilized by the corn plant, but one farm much more effective than the other for control of specific diseases. The third key would be the rate applied or available. We usually see the greatest response to nutrition when we're going from a deficient to a sufficient level for the plant. And the example that I've shown here with tan spot on wheat, you see that if you just provide a sufficiency of nitrogen to either farm, and you'll see a marked reduction in severity of this disease, and you get up to a full sufficiency, and you have practical control from an economic standpoint, even though you may have a little bit of disease. But if you also have a situation where you've inhibited nitrification, then you essentially have full control of tan spot. Now, when you go into an excess of a nutrient, it's usually because of the excess influencing other nutrients, because all of the nutrients, you can't do one thing again in that diamond without affecting everything in it. So that you may have, with an excess, you may have changed the availability of other nutrients that are critical to that disease expression. But the rate of nitrogen or nutrient becomes important. As you can see here with silicon and blast disease on rice. We also see the same thing on wheat with wheat blast. That as you increase the silicon content, you'll see the blast severity drop off dramatically in that area. Well, silicon is it's not an essential nutrient, but it's a beneficial nutrient because it also influences manganese and other nutrients that then are mobilized in that infection site to wall off and control these diseases. With other diseases, this is soft rot caused by Erwinia carotabra. You see with calcium, that as we increase the availability of calcium, you'll see that the pectolytic activity, either from polygalacturonase and especially from pectin transaminase, drops off or is suppressed, and disease severity then is economically controlled. You see even insects respond to nutrition. In this case, as you increase your availability of boron, your red spider mite drops off. And almost red spider mite, as we say it in most crops, is an indicator of a number of deficiencies. And that's why you see it with drought, because your solubility of these nutrients for uptake is greatly reduced. And you see that plant under a nutrient stress, so that the spider mite can capitalize on that condition of the plant. You'll see it with aphids, that the form of nitrogen will influence the aphid infestation. A sick plant just sends up a red flag and tells those insects that, hey, here's something that needs to be corrected. I mentioned the changes that you'll see with an excess of certain nutrients, and need to realize that all of those nutrients interact with other nutrients, either to increase or to decrease their availability, so that we can utilize that. We do it all the time for corn, for maize, when we have high potash soils. If you have that high available potassium in the kernel primordial stage, it will suppress kernel primordial formation, so that we'll usually in those conditions, we'll use a few 100 pounds of gypsum or another source of calcium to suppress the early uptake of potassium, which then after that kernel primordial formation stage, and especially during kernel phase, then that high potassium that we want, all that we can get at that stage available for the plant, is still available for the plant. But in the early stages where its potassium is a high excess, we can suppress its uptake some with some gypsum or calcium to do that. So there are other ways to do it also, but we want to point out that when you're applying manure, you're applying a lot of nutrients that are interacting, and that they may provide the nutrient to start with, but they remember that they're also influencing the availability of other nutrients, either in a plus or minus relationship. And we can modify the rate then of our input to modify the availability and of these other nutrients. One method.
Hi, Don. Sorry, Don, it's Marla. I just have to let you know that I'm giving you a 5-minute warning here. So I know you have such great information to share, but I just wanted to jump in.
Let me move this a little, but there are a lot of examples. Fourth method here is the time and method applied. And what you see with the winter kill, we're applying the nitrogen generally in February is when the fungus is active. If we go before or after that stage, when the weather conditions have changed and the plant is growing actively, we have very effective control. And you can see time of nutrient application for eye spot disease and other diseases here. The amount and form of the nutrient become very important, and we can reduce the amount by our incorporation versus banding or foliar spray of nutrient. The fifth key would be that source and the associated ions that are with it. And we see that with different sources of potassium. You're more limited with your organic, but especially the sixth key would be the most important there, and that's making sure that you integrate your nutritional programs with your other practices. What you see on the left is a study where we were looking at the effect of glyphosate compared with other herbicides on subsequent crops from the soybean that had been genetically engineered, and we could see every glyphosate plot by the increase in take-all, because it inhibits or immobilizes the manganese. But you can also see that same effect with the press wheel, so that a firm seed bed has been recommended for 150 years to reduce the severity of take-all. And you can see this on the right side of that slide. Those 4 rows, I left the press wheel down on my drill. On the left side, I had raised the press wheel, and you can see a 14 part per million difference in manganese in where we had that press wheel because we had more anaerobic sites in the soil, and we've actually lost stand and severe disease or nutrient deficiency, showing where we didn't have that press wheel down from where we had much more severe takeoffs. So a lot of our cultural practices become very important here. I'll just quickly mention that all of our herbicides are chelators. You're not involved with these, but you need to know about them, because if you're transitioning from conventional to organic, there's a long residual process to have a lot of these nutrients available then for you. And without these nutrients, if you're in the Canadian prairies, Ian Evans would tell you that make sure you get your copper level up, or you're going to have severe ergot. And sometimes that's generally with adding it to those soils because you don't have copper, and he'd tell you to get copper sulfate or another source of copper out to reduce your ergot so that you don't have the male sterility and the opening of the glooms to receive the spores of the claviceps, but you see it with the other diseases. Again, with glyphosate, you see that mineral chelation, and it also then has the antibiotic effect that you can see through the soil, and its effect then on the diseases, over 40 diseases that we now see re-emerging because of our indiscriminate use of this one compound. But if we get our magnesium and manganese level up, even as a seed treatment, you can control sudden death syndrome and these other diseases. This is citrus variegated chlorosis that I mentioned in Brazil. We went in with brachiaria grass in that bottom series. The top series that you see up there is with the glyphosate weed control. What we did to control this disease, which was intensified by the glyphosate dramatically, was we went in with brachiaria grass, common weed grass in Brazil. It inhibits nitrification, so that we mulch the grass under the trees then to provide weed control, but it also leached out the compounds to inhibit nitrification, and within 3 years, we had full sufficiency provided to the orchard, as you can see on the right, rather than that skeleton of trees with the continuous glyphosate use. And our tissue levels showed that we were at full sufficiency, and the disease disappears because zinc will block the oxidation of manganese that plugs up the xylem vascular system for the plant. So that when we look at nutrition, we know that it's an integral part of efficient crop production, both for crop quality and quantity, but remember that it's also a very powerful means for disease control. We can change the nutrient-related interactions by managing the plant environment and pathogen effects on disease to increase resistance and defense response, and to reduce virulence and survival of the pathogens also. We have a number of principles that we can employ. We can use nutrient rate, farm, time, source, and method of application to all enhance the benefit of nutrition for controlling disease. And there's enough flexibility here that we can integrate nutrition and cultural practices for optimum yield and still have disease control and overall plant health, especially nutrient quality and nutrient density in that product that we're raising. There's a lot of opportunities for research in these areas to further enhance them, but there's enough known now that by just integrating them in our program, we can have very effective disease control and very nutritious food. So I thank you for the opportunity to share and to participate with you. Certainly wish all of you success, because you're the key to turning around the chronic disease situation and making agriculture sustainable, and also with my vested interest, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren much happier and much healthier. Many thanks, Carla, and all of you in the organic programs.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Don, for your presentation. I do have one question. And the question is, has there been work done as to how these nutrition issues can be addressed without inputs?
There are two phases to that. Without input, it's a matter of modifying your environment, and that's assuming that you have all of those nutrients in an available form and unavailable for the plant uptake. Quite, if you're looking at virgin soil, that may be the case, but not necessarily. So that we need some input from most of our soils, because we've been cropping them for 50 or 100 years or longer. And but for many of them, it's true that all what we need is just to modify that environment, and we can do that through cover cropping or through crop rotation. Crop sequence is more important from a disease control standpoint usually than the length of the crop rotation. And that's where cover cropping becomes very helpful for us, or companion cropping. But you need to know what nutrients you really need to target in that area, so that you can select your cover crop mix. For instance, lupin versus vetch. You'll have an opposite effect on the form of nitrogen that's going to be available for that subsequent crop or companion crop. And matter of selecting those and having a knowledge of what that biology is doing, or what we want it to do when we select those plants in our cover crop mix.
All right, thank you. And one last question before we let you go. Is well-rotted manure the same as fresh manure for nitrification?
Is what?
Well-rotted manure the same as fresh manure for nitrification?
In general, both will stimulate nitrification, because but your fresh manure will be more active. Two elements that are really critical for our soil organisms. Most of them are very hungry for nitrogen and very hungry for carbon, for sugars or carbohydrate. And so the manure provides both of those, and that's why you see that stimulation of nitrification. The oxidizing organisms are stimulated more than the reducing organisms when you have an increase in nitrification. So it would be a matter of looking at other organic sources that could either be mixed or from a cover crop or from a residue standpoint. I mentioned the brachiaria. There are a number of those crops that could be mixed with the manure to inhibit nitrification, and it would almost double the efficiency of the nitrogen, and certainly enhance the availability of your phosphorus. That was also a valuable input from that manure.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your questions, and thank you, Don, for your presentation. You know, I was listening to the presentation as a non-scientist and non-farmer, and I just kept thinking you could be talking about, you know, human health, you know, the implications of nutrition and its impact on, you know, on disease, and, you know, the genetics, the nutrient form, all of those things. I could just really relate to human health, and of course made me think of, you know, healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy people. So Thank you. Thank you again so much for being with us today. And one last question, would you mind sharing your presentation with us so we can share with attendees, because there was just a lot of information there that I think they might like to have access to.
Oh, you're more than welcome to use all of it in any way that you feel it would be educationally advantaged.
That's awesome.
So,
okay, well, thank you so much again. We really appreciate you being with us here today. And say thank you to Blue Sky Hemp Ventures for your sponsorship today. So now, moving on to our next presentation, I would like to thank Back to Your Roots, another one of our gold sponsors, and they are the sponsor for this next presentation. So thank you so much, Back to Your Roots. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Chris Trump. He is a world-renowned Korean natural farmer and the first to implement Korean natural farming on a large scale. He was raised on an 800-acre macadamia nut farm on the Big Island of Hawaii and managed the farm from 2009 to 2018. While managing the farm, he led it through the process to convert to a certified organic farm using exclusively natural farming inputs made on the farm. In the last 4 years, the farm has been its most profitable in its 30-year existence. Chris is passionate about sustainable farming, and his heart is to equip, empower, and inform gardeners, farmers, and philanthropists of Korean natural farming techniques to transform livestock and crop production at very little cost. So we are very pleased to have Chris speaking with us today, and he will be providing us with an overview of the complexity of the interconnection between soil, microbial life, and nutrient uptake and yield. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks, guys. It's a pleasure to be here. It's actually so much fun to be able to hang out with farmers while the world seems so strange. So I'm grateful. Yeah, I was born on a farm and on the Big Island of Hawaii, and we farmed pigs and pineapples and eggplant. I hate eggplant to this day because I think for a year we ate a whole lot of eggplant. And with typical farming, we weren't always profitable. There were many things we tried growing up that did not pan out. You know, they were a lot of fun, or we broke even, but it wasn't something to go forward with. And then we started macadamia nuts. Let's see if I can see myself. So this is our crop on our farm. It's we sell end dumps, about 70 end dumps full of marbles. We produce about 1.5 to 2 million pounds of macadamia nut wet in shell or unprocessed macadamia nuts per year. And it's a lot of fun and a lot of work. We had a journey where we have two different landowners, and one wanted to have only organic practices practiced on our farm. And so I think in around 2008, we began an organic program. It might have been a little before that, and we really struggled. It was quite terrible as far as yield, cost. We're on an island, so increasing cost to bring over an organic set of nutrients was really prohibitive, and our trees didn't perform better. And at that time, we weren't getting a premium. It was really hard because there wasn't a processor. Long story short, we discovered a method, or were introduced to a method of tending to the microbial life of the soil to farm that took us down a long journey. I was in Korea 10 times studying there. And we currently use something called Korean natural farming. We actually, only in the US do we call it Korean. natural farming, and everywhere else in the world is called natural farming. And we've had a ton of success. We started pretty skeptical, but we're loving it. So I travel around the world teaching this now. My favorite thing to do is teach in the third world because it's a knowledge-based agricultural system, showing how our land, our indigenous microorganisms, and our weeds end up being the nutrition necessary even for large-scale commercial agriculture. So being able to go, I was just in Myanmar last year working with a hill tribe of coffee farmers, and we were able to teach them how to harvest their own indigenous inoculum and produce their own inputs for their farm using the free organic matter and resources available to them. And they're now almost a year into it and just doing amazing. I have a bunch of pictures. I've been put them in the slide. What I want to talk about today is a brief look at 3 papers that were published actually fairly recently. One was last year, but these papers kind of give a little bit of a bracket to just how complex nature is in regards to nutrient uptake, yield, and the production of fertilizer that your plants actually eat. To the end that we could kind of agree together that this is pretty big, almost a new frontier, an undiscovered territory of agriculture. And I would say that these are things we had 3 or 4 generations ago and just kind of lost. So we'll talk briefly about some of the fun things that happen in the nitrogen cycle and ways that nature makes it work for plants. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we farm, and you guys can definitely reach out after this or have the presentation, or we can talk later, and I have ways you can find more information about this. But let's get into our nerdy science stuff. Okay, sorry guys, this little thing is blocking. There we go. So the effect of fungal bacterial ratios in our soil or even on our plants have a direct effect on nutrient uptake, and it involves a natural law, and this is affecting you whether you like it or not. So understanding this is something I've come to find that we're affected as farmers directly. Yield, the time we have on our farm, and the quality of our produce by these natural laws. And we're just, as a scientific community, just beginning to understand the complexity and the interconnectivity of the microbial world and its interaction with the plant's function. So real quick, we're going to look at the nutrient nitrogen cycle, which I'm sure a lot of you know. But one of the things that's interesting for me, and I think important for us as farmers, is our plants, generally speaking, and we're growing all different kinds of things probably represented in this room, but generally speaking, our plants prefer to eat ammonium or a organic form of nitrogen that really isn't something we get off the shelf. And nitrates are not necessarily our friend. So nitrification is, in nature, is a 2-step oxidation process where ammonium or ammonia is converted to nitrate. And that's facilitated by a ton of bacteria that exist in nature. In this study, this team of Japanese scientists analyzed that natural nitrogen cycle when without human involvement in Japanese cedars. And archaea are a microbe that exists in nature, and in this case, they're analyzing the archaea that exist on the actual leaves of the plant. So this study's showing that the archaea that exist on that leaf surface are actually affecting and using atmospheric and rainfall nitrogen in a really specific way. So the trees have this archaea on their leaves that are unique or specific to Japanese cedar. They oxidize ammonia, but almost no nitrates are produced in the entire process in this tree's canopy and even in their drip zone. Really, really fun study, and a big one. If you want to look into it, please do. You can have the slides after. I just recommend the read, but real quick overview. These microbes oxidize ammonia, making NH3, then with a little rainfall combines to become ammonium. So here's how it works. On the surface of the leaf, the plant is converting atmospheric and rainfall nitrogen to NH3. And as water comes in, the necessary molecules are there to make NH4. Ammonium, which is this tree's ideal food, as we see. It gets better. So as the nitrogen falls out of the tree to its own drip line, the soil zone has a unique, well, it's the tree, we don't exactly understand exactly who and how this complex thing happens, but it's called BNI, biological nitrification inhibition. And so what's happening is as that ammonium comes down, it has the ability in chemistry to become nitrates. However, there are inhibitors from the plant roots that keep it from going to nitrate, so it stays as ammonium and is a great ideal food for trees. This is a beautiful level of complexity that happens in nature, and it's happening in our cropland with our crops. There is an ideal way that plants eat, and we've kind of hacked that over the years. And I'm suggesting, as we're talking, I'm suggesting that we can actually lean into how nature does this and feed our plants in a similar way to what we find in the wild, and just reap benefits in both yield and cost. We can actually reduce our costs when leaning into this law. So here is just a successional chart, and what this is, I'm sure a lot of you know kind of the concept of this, but a lot of your crops exist in this late successional category. Some of you might be in mid-successional, which is great, but these numbers here represent fungal to bacterial ratios. And if this is unfamiliar territory, I highly suggest that this is the catalyst that gets you kind of looking into it. This was a key of knowledge for me. This was huge. And employing or using this knowledge, this natural law to foster growth and production on our farm is, I would say, directly correlated to our current success. Right now, we are more profitable than we've ever been. We didn't change anything. We believe, as far as other structures of our business, we just changed our feeding program. And so we reduced cost while maintaining yields. And that's a big deal. For us on our farm, it's 750 acres of organic macadamia nuts. We currently farm using these natural methods for about the same price we farmed conventionally, and we are getting an organic premium. So it's a big deal for us. And on an island, reducing those import costs of containers was also huge. But back to fungal to bacterial ratio, if these ratios don't exist in your soil, you're leaving stuff on the table. And that's kind of the hard but very important kind of takeaway here, is this exists. Whether or not we're employing it to our benefit as farmers is up to us, but it still affects us whether or not we get into it or understand it or not. And so if you see kind of where your crop falls in here, you see that there's an ideal fungal to bacterial ratio in the soil. And that's something that as farmers we can tend to, we can affect, and we do exactly that on our farm. And I just wanted to kind of share. We won't get too much into the how, that's a rabbit hole you have to go down later. But this concept is extremely important because fungi cycle nutrients for our plants in a very unique and special way and create plant root relationships with our crops. And that free labor, that free minor nutrient production that fungi is supplying to our crops is invaluable. I think my friend was talking earlier, and the implications of yield when a plant's healthy and expressing its whole kind of biochemical expression. We really don't see as much in the way of pests. And if our soil's right for a crop, we actually see a reduction in weeds. And I know that sounds like a pipe dream, but I'm actually going to jump into a study that proves it in a second here. All right, so early successional weeds cannot handle ammonium. So when your system's functioning as nature has it function, or in line with natural law, there's actually a natural weed suppression that occurs because of that fungal to bacterial ratio and because of how nature produces nutrients. So influence, this is a study out of Japan again. Japan, when we had the kind of agricultural industrial revolution, we switched over to conventional agriculture. Japan held on to a whole lot of its kind of probiotic traditional farming, and not only held on to it, they leaned in as science gained new tools to understand it. Japan as a society kind of leaned into studying some of their traditional practices to then kind of reverse engineer or backwards understand what the science is that's going on in their practices. So they've continued it, lots of great studies coming out of Japan in this kind of regenerative agricultural category. And so here what they did is they tested ammonium versus nitrates on a really popular weed or common weed called horsetail or field horsetail. So here is, again, wonderful study, large study. Highly recommend you digging into it and checking it out. But here is a little bit of how it worked. So they applied various concentrations of ammonium and nitrate to these weeds, horsetail. And so right here on the chart, you see the top line graph there is a representation of the growth and overall shoot production in this young weed. So with ammonium, you see the suppression of, or comparative to the nitrates, you see the suppression of yield or production in a weed, this horsetail weed, and which is amazing. Same soil, different nitrogen. So that NH4 caused a reduction in shoot production, whereas the NO3 or nitrates increased production in the weeds. It continues total length of rhizome, so its root kind of area, with ammonium, 0 production. They got nothing. So this kills weeds just by having nature's proper ammonium production, which again, we can get into how to do that. But how cool if you have the the kind of soil food web, the engine that cycles in this complex interchange in the root zone, functioning as kind of natural law would have it, we actually have a natural suppression to this type of weed, this horsetail, but also many of them. So here we have rhizome production and tubers, all inhibited by just ammonium. Nitrates are food for our weeds. So how much can fungi affect nutrient uptake in plants? Last nerdy study here, and then we'll just talk a little bit, or I'll story tell on kind of what we do, how it works, and where you can kind of dig into this kind of partnering with nature to grow food. Arbuscular mycorrhiza fungi increase growth, nutrient uptake, and tolerance to salinity in olive trees under nursery conditions. So we know a farmer, or we have been a farmer that's dealt with high salinity or salts if we've ever farmed conventional. And I grew up doing both. I'm super grateful for that experience. But here, what they're doing is they're taking that eventuality, or that thing that happens in agriculture where some people have brackish water or real high salinity in their environment because of how it was farmed before. We're talking about this always as farmers, especially taking on new land. And what they did is they tested microbial life's presence, or specifically 3 forms of mycorrhizae, and how that affected kind of the tolerance of a plant. Here, it's an olive tree or young olive trees in their growing environment, how their yield, their production was affected by the presence or the lack of microbial life. So fun stuff. Here we have shoot and root growth with a list of the control, and then these 3 microbes you have here with their Latin names are all mycorrhizae fungi, and I'm going to jump down to table 3 just for time's sake. We are here seeing the in table 3 a treatment with extremely high salinity or NaCl salt on the right, and low or regular growing conditions on the left. And so if you go down to the control, we have number of shoots, stem diameter, maximum length, but then you jump down to width, same trees, same genetics. They did this all in pots. I think it was 10 replications per treatment, and we'll have to check that in the study or when you read it. But they did a bunch of replications, which was nice. And the number of shoots with just the introduction of 1 species of mycorrhiza fungi, if you look at G. mosaic, and I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. I get like that with some of these words, but it's a mycorrhiza fungi that exists naturally, and they've brought it in an isolated form and applied it to the root zone of these potted nursery plants in high salinity conditions and regular growing conditions. And what I want to point out is the comparison of growth for the treatment with the mycorrhiza fungi and the treatment without. And this is pretty good. The next one is also extremely indicative of how important this is. So here we have a pretty good continuation of growth from one treatment to the other, kind of across the board, with a little hindrance with the salinity. This next one, you see the, let's go back. I'm sorry. All right, so here we go. I'm sorry, I got turned around on my own slide. So the here we go. So the NPK or nutrient uptake, utilization efficiency, and then just nutrient concentration found in the plant. We have just incredible kind of resistance to the effect of, let's see, I'm trying to show you one of them. I might skip this for now. Sorry about that. So basically the conclusion or the outcome of this is that the effect of mycorrhizal fungi kind of stopped the hindrance that high salinity can have on uptake or yield or production of trees. Basically, these plants did not, they actually show similar or comparable concentrations of nutrients, but significantly more growth. Whereas the control was taking in some nutrients, it didn't actually use it efficiently. It didn't put it into production like we see in with just that introduction of mycorrhiza. So drastically better growth with mycorrhiza. If you look at that bottom line, we're getting better stem diameter, better number of shoots, better maximum length. And then we're also not seeing much of a slowdown as a result of high salinity. So really cool that we can have kind of a protection from that. This is a microbial report from one of our inoculum that we produce for our farm. It's just a plant-based compost. We call it indigenous microorganism number 4, just 4 steps to cultivate your area's kind of snapshot of your area's indigenous microbial life. And the reason we use indigenous or teach people how to collect their own inoculum, 1, it's an empowerment for the farmer. You don't have to buy bugs in a jug, they're expensive. But 2, because these microbes, like your rainfall, your barometric pressure, your soil, they self-perpetuate. So as long as you're tending to that life, year after year, your soil gets better. It's like a bank account. And great organic farmers understand that. They understand that their soil is like a bank account. Tending to it in the fall so that you're ready in the spring is what we have to do to really take care of what we have as farmers under our feet. And so this is kind of how we do it. We do it as we brew a tea with this inoculum, or we apply it solid. And so we do big windrows, have a compost turner. But I've also worked with small farmers and indoor farmers and golf courses and grape farmers. And all of them are able to get this effect that we're experiencing on our farm just by tending to the microbial life of the soil. And then we make some plant extracts that are really easy and inexpensive to make that become our food. We also do one with fish. It's a fish-based nitrogen, which is incredible. But really, again, we're trying to use things that are relatively free or inexpensive. Just to point out on this chart real quick that about halfway down, there's a TF-TB ratio there. Total fungi to total bacteria, 6.79. This is around the range where we like, meaning that my inoculum, what I'm putting on my farm, is boosting up my fungal ratio to bacterial ratio, which as vegetable or just general crop farmers, we probably need this. As we work our land, it skews towards bacterial. It's just tilling skews it towards bacterial because the fungi are fairly delicate and they take some time to establish in our soil zone. So using using microbial life to, or using our indigenous microbial life to kind of tend to the productivity of our cropland is huge. And I think really is something we should be moving towards. And all those kind of fun papers and studies are showing that nature actually has an incredible and complex system for doing this. And if we can kind of partner with it instead of trying to hack it, we actually can reap the benefits of incredible design, it's a symphony. Nature's like a symphony. It's like all working together, and we don't have enough computing power in the whole world to understand the interconnections in a cubic inch of soil. How all these microbes work in community, we don't even know. And if there's a scientist in the room that says they know, I'll call you a liar, because we just don't know yet. We don't understand how they work together. And but even though we don't understand, we can't put it in our test tube and analyze it. We can look at it, observe it as conscientious farmers, and implement or use natural law to grow food. And that is what farmers did for generations. They were the best scientists before our university systems. The farmers, because science is the study of nature through observation and experimentation. And farmers would watch what they were doing. And next year, if they tried something new and it didn't work, they didn't continue it. They didn't teach that to their son. It didn't get passed down. So after 1,000 years of trial and error, the things that the fathers were teaching the sons were established principles that worked with natural law, that grew food, that tended to the life of their soil. And as we look at these traditional practices, and we kind of practice a hybrid of enzymatic theory from Japan, as well as an elegant form of agriculture tending to the microbial life of the soil that came out of South Korea. This man, Cho Han Yu, who I call Master Cho, not because he's my master or anything, but it is the term of respect for a teacher in South Korea. And respect's a big thing in South Korea. And he's a great teacher, but he saw the need for farmers to have a system as the conventional agriculture came into South Korea. And he's not someone you can really get a hold of. He's, I think 86 in South Korea, and I talk to him periodically, and he does visit the US, but he just took together a few traditional practices from Asia, Japan and South Korea, and put it into an elegant method. There's lots of ways to do this. Natural farming, like I practice, isn't the only way. But understanding these concepts, that there's a complexity here and we can partner with it, I think is the key. So that is the entirety of my kind of nerdy science explanations on it. But I do, and let you know there's a huge amount of knowledge that's available and becoming much more available to learn online how to do some of this stuff. And we're seeing success in many fields. I'm working with a grape farmer in Napa Valley. We ran a trial on her farm, 10 acres side by side, 5 and 5, and she was able to deal with powdery mildew using this indigenous microorganism, using a liquid microbial brew that was so much of the big guys were applied to the leaves that the plant was able to protect itself or have protection because of the microbial life from powdery mildew. She went all the way to harvest. Well, right next to her, the powdery mildew was heavy where they weren't applying it. So we're moving to a 15-acre trial this year, and this couple contract farms 750 acres of wine grapes, and so we might have organic wine coming out of Napa Valley. We've helped the most played golf course in San Francisco have no more disease. They don't need to buy fungicides or pesticides, and they don't use any more traditional fertilizer. They just use this liquid microbial and some fish amino acid, we call it, that they made from free fish waste that they got heads and guts. And he has some of the most beautiful greens. I went out there and walked with him. He cored his greens, so we got about an 1/8 inch of grass in sand because they can't have any water build up. And he's got 10 inches of root growth in sand just because there's life in the soil. So yeah, I'm grateful. It really, I feel like it saved our farm, this kind of shift. And as a result, I feel like our whole world could benefit from a step in this direction. And so making myself available, my younger brother's managing the farm now. My dad's just about done. They're both great farmers, and my brother's a great manager. So confidence in good hands. And now I'm off to share this where I can with who will listen. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. I do have some questions, so we'll start going through those. The first one is, what is the best way to test FB ratios in our soils?
That's a great question. There's several labs, microbial labs, that will do that for you. That lab analysis that I showed was I think it was a $100, $110 test by Earthfort LLC. There are many labs like them that will analyze your bacteria, your fungi, flagellates, ciliates, amoeba, and give you kind of a grade for nitrogen cycling based on the microbial life you have. So yeah, just look up a biological lab or soil analysis lab in your area. Or you could send it to Earthfort, I think.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then there's a follow-on question since you have that slide up now. So on the compost report, you mentioned, or it shows that the active fungi is 0. And the question was just why is that 0?
I'll explain that. Can you see my my presentation here still?
Yes, yeah, we can. It's minimized. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. I forgot to explain. This is a dormant sample. So I made it, and then it's stored, or this is a shelf-stable material. So after it's finished, it's used. The microbes have used up all the liquid or moisture that I applied to the pile initially to get it going. It's all used up. This is a dry, almost powder-like material when it's finished. And under a microscope, it looks like a bag of marbles. It's full of fungal spores. So that's where you see total fungi, but not active fungi. It's because it's all sporulated and it's waiting for the reintroduction to water or to be placed on soil so that it can wake up. Same thing with bacteria. The bacteria goes dormant. So our active bacteria is much lower than our total bacteria. So it's just because it's a dormant sample. If I took this sample or sent away the sample when I was in the midst of kind of growing out these microbes on this substrate, then it would look very different as far as active and inactive.
Okay. So the next question is, how do folks figure out what inoculant they need in their area?
Great question. It's a bit of a rabbit hole. I have a YouTube channel. If you just search Chris Trump on YouTube, and I have a instructional video called IMO1, Indigenous Microorganism, and it's the first step. And it shows you kind of the concept of going out into your environment. And we use rice as an auger or material to grow out the fungi in an indigenous environment, because rice has a high protein fat profile. It actually has one of the highest fat protein profiles in grains in nature. So you ever think about Asian cultures and why they're all fit and whatnot, and they eat so much rice? Doesn't rice make you fat? Well, really, rice is extremely rich in fats and proteins, and so it's a lot more keto than eating wheat or something. And those fat proteins, those complex amino acids, those chains are actually fungal food. What they do is they get into that lignin layer in the rice or into the amino acids, these fatty acid chains, and they break it apart, and they use the lipids, and then their byproducts are these fulvic and humic acids, and that's where you see all that rich kind of humic or humate material that's in like an old growth forest or something. That's the fungi breaking apart the lignins in the cell walls and then leaving behind these complex acids because they've eaten the fat. So we grow it out on rice, it blooms, and then we make it shelf stable by mixing it with dry sugar. And that osmotic pressure traps all the water in the environment in chemical bonds so that all our fungi that we just collected and is one generation removed from the wild sporulates and goes dormant. So we're not constantly producing something that's just sitting there waiting to be reintroduced to water and food. And so it's a way for a farmer to have a shelf-stable inoculum from their environment for the cost of a few pounds of sugar and a bag of rice.
Okay, another question here. How do you capture these useful mycorrhizal fungi from the local environment? And how do you get a sufficient amount to be practically useful? I think you might have kind of answered that a little bit, but
I did. I do want to touch on the last part of that question though.
Yeah, for sure.
So YouTube, IMO1, just search my name, Chris Trump. There's a website, christrump.com. There's some sheets you can download that are free. But the question of how do you get enough to be useful, I totally understand what you're asking, because it's like, you know, even in the video, you see me put out this little, you know, lunchbox size thing of rice. And it's like, wait, don't you farm 750 acres? How is that even a drop in the bucket? And that was my same process when I learned this. They were teaching wheelbarrow scale stuff. And I'm like, one wheelbarrow at a time, 750 acres, 35 years, I'll be finished with one round, you know? And so this is very scalable. But remember, what we're doing is we bring these microbes out of old growth forest or old prairie land or wherever we're getting this kind of wild, the idea, and remember this, if you are going to try it, the ideal is untouched environments where nature has had a chance or had time to establish its own balance. Balance and diversity are what we're going for when we tend to the microbial life of the soil. The more diversity, the less risk of disease. Disease are opportunistic microorganisms generally. And if the big guys are there, they have a much harder time getting established or running away with environment. Okay, back to your question. This is a bag of seeds. When we finish this IMO1, it's got a bloom and we put it on our shelf. If I look at it under a microscope, it's full of spores. Each spore can open up into its own fungal hypha, fungal body, and does its thing, and then can sporulate again and make 10 to 20 other spores. And so when we use this, and even that inoculum there, my compost sheet, it's seeds, if you will. So then I brew it out, and all I'm doing is spraying. If I spray liquid or I apply a solid indigenous microorganism, 4th stage, which is mixed with soil, what I'm doing is I'm putting a very small amount, just like you think about when you get your little lettuce packet, your seeds. You don't cover your whole, you know, acre in an inch of lettuce seed. You don't need to. All you need is a few of them and they'll grow lettuce. It's the same concept here. We have this huge, diverse community of microbes we pulled out of our local environment. All we need is the seeds of them on our ag land. Because they're indigenous, they'll self-perpetuate. As soon as they get established, they'll continue to establish themselves and develop community because they like your winter. They've been there for 1,000 years. They like your summer. They like your rainfall. They like your soil. That's why we're collecting from your environment. If you get bugs in a jug, it's really effective for growing plants, but they'll get outcompeted by indigenous microbes because the indigenous microbes love that environment. Whereas the bugs in the jug are grown in a lab in Okinawa, Japan, or some other place in the world. And they have about a 6-month fall off. That's approximate. So they are helpful for cycling nutrients, but you got to keep buying that jug. So here we're seeding, and then it self-perpetuates. You're going to see that in your soil year after year. It's really fun.
All right, and just one last question before we let you go. Do you use vermicompost, and can it be useful adding diverse foods?
I love vermicompost. Vermicompost leachate, when you pass water through, kind of like making coffee. You know, if you have established vermicompost and then you pass a little extra water through, you get this black material. If you've made good vermicompost, and that leachate is the best possible source of humic fulvic acid compounds. So that's a great fungal food. It's a great additive to any liquid, actively aerated compost tea or amendment. Yeah, I'm all for vermicompost. I think it's excellent. Some people do it really well, and some people don't do it so well. So there's that. But yeah, generally, I don't look to vermicompost for diversity because we're so good at establishing diversity with this system. Vermicompost is more of a food or a optional amendment compared to this microbial mix I'm talking about making. Typically in organic, we look at vermicompost as our inoculum. A lot of people rely on it for making their compost tea or whatever, and I would say it's extremely limited in diversity in comparison to what we're talking about. So if that's all you got, it's an excellent thing to use. But if you can get into a little bit of indigenous diversity, it'll serve you really well, and you can still use your vermicompost as a supplement.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much, Chris. And as I was listening to your presentation, what really resonated with me or was thankful that you introduced just again to us, or reminding us about the complexity and perfection of nature, and that agriculture is actually like disturbing perfection, right? And that doesn't make it a bad thing. We just need to recognize that that's what we're doing, and that there's all of this indigenous. Yeah,
it doesn't have to. We can be stewards of beautiful soil that cycles carbon and all kinds of great stuff. But absolutely. And I think too, the other point for me is around recognizing traditional and indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge, and that they don't need to be in opposition to one another, but that there's a recognition that that they all have something to add to the conversation, and that our conversations and openness to ideas should be generative, right, rather than deductive or reductive. So I really appreciate you bringing that into the mix today for us. So thank you so much. My pleasure.
Our last presentation of the morning, and would like to thank our gold sponsors, ProCert, who are celebrating their 30th year in business today. So thank you so much. And also to FW Cobbs for their sponsorship, their gold sponsorship for today. So thank you again. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Andrew Hammermeister. Dr. Andrew Hammermeister is the director of the Organic Agricultural Centre of Canada, an associate professor in the Faculty of Agriculture at Dalhousie University. He has a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, specializing in soil science from the University of Saskatchewan, a Master's of Science in Land Reclamation, and a PhD in Applied Ecology from the University of Alberta. Andrew is the Science Director for the Organic Science Cluster, the Coordinated National Initiative for Organic Agricultural Research in Canada. He sits on the National Organic Standards Review Committee and several other organic sector committees. And so without further ado, here is Dr. Hammermeister, and he will be talking today about translating organic science into practice. So thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much, Marla, for that nice introduction. And it's always, I was really looking forward to being out in Saskatchewan today. Many of you know that I am originally from Saskatchewan. I always enjoy the opportunity to come out and visit the prairies and visit all my friends and family at home and get in touch with the organic growers there. This isn't the same, but I still appreciate the opportunity to get my head into the prairie groove for a little while. So as Marla introduced, I'm going to be talking today about translating organic science into practice. And so a lot of what I'll be covering today is relating to the National Organic Science Cluster Program. So I'm going to point you to your control panel, and under the control panel, or on the control panel, you should see a little tab that says handouts. And 3 of those handouts I've provided relating to Organic Science Cluster 2, Organic Science Cluster 3, and then lastly, the field crop breeding bulletin that we have. And so as I'm presenting, you might be looking through some of these resources, and you'll see a list of all of the research activities associated with the science cluster. So as Marla mentioned, the Organic Science Cluster Program is the national science program for organic agriculture in the country. So we are funded through the Canadian Agricultural Partnerships Program, and all of the other commodity groups have science clusters as well. So we're in the same pool of funds as they are. Our science cluster for the organic sector is supported by or led by the Organic Federation of Canada in collaboration with ourselves at the OACC and Dalhousie University. We're currently on our 3rd science cluster. The first one started in 2009, and the 3rd one that we're working on right now ends in 2023. So it's really important that we try and disseminate the results of all of the research that's coming out of these science clusters. So let's take a quick look at what Science Cluster 3 looks like. And so here's a quick infographic. And if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you should see all of the themes that we're working on. We actually have 27 different research activities that are happening at institutions right across Canada in all of these 5 themes. So a lot of work going on. And so you can imagine that that means that there's a lot of researchers engaged. In fact, we have over 70 researchers working at over 36 Agriculture Canada research stations and universities across the country. So a lot of people putting some effort into this. It also means that we're training graduate students. And I think that this is really important to consider or to note, because the graduate students are the new young people who are going to be the professionals that are working in agriculture, either in service support industries or in government as extension agents, or perhaps our future scientists. And giving them a training in organic agriculture is really important. Now, the Organic Science Cluster would not be possible without the support of industry partners. And so while this is funded about 2/3 by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Agri Science Initiative, the rest of the funding is coming from industry, and we have to have that industry funding in order to leverage the federal funding. So I'm going to be focusing on the grains today. I'm not going to be talking about fruits or anything like that, or vegetables. I am going to try and focus on grains, and the grains side of things is being supported by the top row is really the most important group from the Organic Science Cluster 3 perspective, but all of the partners are extremely valuable. So Western Grains Research Foundation has been a really major contributor to the Organic Science Cluster 3, along with Grain Millers, Nature's Path, and Seed Change. And so those are big ones that have been major contributors. But we also really appreciate the support and input of Prairie Oat Growers, Alberta Wheat Commission, Sask Wheat, Winter Cereals Development Commission, Milanese, which is out in Quebec, Sask Pulse Growers, Manitoba Pulse Soybean, Austera, FFM, Grain Farmers of Ontario, CCAN, and Prairie Heritage Seeds Organics. So these are the partners that are contributing to the grains research projects in the Organic Science Cluster, but there's a whole bunch of other partners that are also supporting organic work right across the country in other themes. And I will mention that the research, a lot of this research is happening in collaboration with farmers. There's over 150 individual farms participating in all of the different research activities. And so it's really key, and we think it's really important for research to be happening on farms so that we're really mimicking or studying advances in practices and technologies under organic management. So we're very grateful for those farmers who are participating as well. So I'm going to start by talking about breeding in relation mostly to the cereals and oilseeds, and I'm going to show you this nice bulletin that we produced just this year. And this is giving an overview of all of the research that has been involved in breeding for organic production in the last 10 to 15 years, maybe even a little bit longer. And so that is one of the bulletins that you have up on in the handout tab on your control panel. You can also find it on our website if you need to look for it under the Organic Science Cluster 3 tab. So the breeding programs have been led by several researchers out west. Jennifer Mitchell-Fetch, who of course is retired now and was really responsible for the oat breeding program. And she worked closely in collaboration with Dr. Martin Entz on that, as well as working with Stephen Fox on the wheat program. Dr. Dean Spanner at the University of Alberta was also one of the leaders in doing organic wheat breeding in the country, in working with Pierre Huckel at the University of Saskatchewan as well. So I just wanted to, I'm going to give you an overview, a synthesis of some of the key results of the work in the prairies. And in this case, I think what was really important was that we first had to justify that wheat breeding, or that breeding for organic management, was actually useful, that it was important. We had to be able to convince the government and breeding programs that you will develop different traits if you're selecting lines under organic management than if you were under conventional management. Otherwise, we could just use all of the modern conventional lines of crops. So it was really interesting and to see that, and this is what I like about science, that it often is reinforcing what we intuitively might expect. But we saw that Dr. Spanner and Dr. Martin Entz and Stephen Fox and their research teams have found that, yes, indeed, if you are selecting lines under organic management, those lines will perform better under organic conditions than lines selected under conventional management. So, so that's really important. And so you ask, well, why is that? And I think most people would kind of get a handle on this. Conventional breeding programs are based on conventional production systems that are using optimum field conditions and using high levels of fertility and high levels of inputs. Basically, you're trying to create the optimum conditions for crop growth under that chemical management system, what they regard as optimum. And but in organic systems, we are dealing with a much different timing and availability of nutrients in the soil. We're dealing with different levels of weed competition, and definitely a different soil biology, which was covered very nicely by our last two presenters. So I find this research is particularly important because it not only helps us in organic agriculture, but it also widens the genetics, the genetic pool that can help support other low input production systems. And so we can start transferring these genetics into conventional agriculture as well, in terms of low input agriculture. So we're not just serving our interests, but we're creating genetic diversity through this. I wanted to just also touch briefly on the fact that it's not just in wheat that we saw this advantage, or clear advantage in breeding under organic management. We also have researchers in Ontario, Dr. Raj Khan, who's got a graduate student, has had a couple of grad students actually, who've been looking at soybean and asking the same question: is it worthwhile selecting and breeding soybean under organic management? And can they be more competitive, and if they're selected that way, and more productive? And indeed, they're finding the same thing, that it is worthwhile selecting soybean lines under organic management for organic conditions. So again, very valuable research, reinforcing that. So I want to acknowledge the amazing work that Dr. Jennifer Mitchell-Fetch has done over the last 20 years, really, on organic oat breeding, and in collaboration with Dr. Martin Entz and Steve Shirtliff and Dean Spanner, all helping out. But I really want to give her some credit for bringing some of these new cultivars to market. So AAC Oravina and AAC Kongsor are two oat lines that have been brought to market through Jennifer's work. And then she also collaborated with Stephen Fox to develop AAC Tradition, and which is also available on the marketplace. Now, if we want to have organic wheat breeding, we have to have farmers using the cultivars that are produced. And wheat breeders and seed companies are not interested in investing a lot of time and money in producing seed that farmers aren't buying. So I strongly encourage you to at least try these cultivars out and make sure and see if they fit in your operation. Of course, if they're not working out, if they're not suited to your operation, then so be it. But I encourage you to at least explore using these cultivars and seeing how they work under organic management. Otherwise, we won't have organic breeding programs continuing. Another really interesting breeding program is the participatory plant breeding project that is being led by Dr. Martin Entz out of the University of Manitoba. And he's collaborating with researchers across the country looking at breeding field crops, mainly cereals and also some potatoes, for organic management. But he's doing it in this unique way where the farmers are actually engaged in the breeding and selection process. And this work is being supported by Seed Change and the Bauta Family Initiative and Seed Security. And I think it's really interesting because it means you're taking pools of genetics, basically that resulting from a cross, taking it out to a field and letting farmers plant those lines, those genetics, really varied genetics, and seeing what will grow, and then they will select the heads of the grains that they think are most appropriate for their fields. And so they can select for the traits that they think are best on their farm. And interestingly, and I really didn't know what to expect from this research when we started it all, or when Dr. Martin Entz and others started it, but interestingly, they found that when that pool of seed, that original seed, was split, some of it went to conventional breeding and some of it went to farmer selection processes. And they ultimately, after several years of work, had found, had selected a narrower line of genetics. And when they compared those lines of genetics, some of the farmer selected lines outperformed those that were found on research station breeding programs. So very interesting and outcome, and it reinforces how important it is why we need genetic diversity, because the environments that we're growing our crops in are so diverse that we need to have genetics that work in those environments. And that's how we're going to increase yield and create greater resilience in our crops than if we are simply using the same genetics everywhere. So there are a couple of other research projects that are being carried out at the University of Manitoba under this project, in addition to the ongoing breeding program, and looking at whether these farmer-selected lines are more effective in capturing soil phosphorus, and whether the farmer-selected wheat varieties are more effective in using organic amendments. Of course, we have different amendments than what conventional agriculture has, and so we need to be selecting for those conditions. So very interesting research coming up. The last bit of breeding work that's going on in the prairies in relation to cereals is the winter cereal for mulch cover project that Dr. Raja Ragaputhy at AFC Lethbridge is leading, and in collaboration with Jamie Larson and some great technical support as well. And essentially, I find this research really cool because we are not actually breeding for yield, or, well, kinda. We're breeding for not grain yield, we're breeding for biomass production because we want to create a mulch that we can do no-till farming into. And you might remember that the Rodale roller system, and you can see the roller there with the chevron blades in the photo, but you might remember that the Rodale system started with rolling down fall rye and then direct seeding soybean into that fall rye. And the fall rye created this thick mulch that weeds could not grow through, and you had the allelopathic effects of chemical suppression of weeds as well. And you could plant the soybean straight into it. This was a little bit more challenging for us in Canada because the flowering timing of fall rye is fairly late. You know, it starts a little bit later than what we would like, and that's the timing when you have to crimp it so that it doesn't regrow. And so it was less effective as a tool for us because the timing didn't work out, and we had some yield potential losses as a result of that late planting. We also need to have enough biomass to suppress weeds. So this project is actually focusing on trying to optimize these fall-winter cereals for mulch production, and which is a whole different way of looking at things in my mind. We're not looking at grain yield, we're looking at biomass production and earlier flowering so that it's more suitable for no-till organic systems. And they're not just looking at fall rye, they're actually looking at triticale as well, which seems to have, even though it's flowering a little bit later, it has a narrower flowering window, and so you might have better success with roller crimping. So hopefully we'll see some new lines of fall rye and maybe even triticale that'll come out that are designed specifically for weed management rather than for grain production. So let's delve a little bit further into weed management and soil fertility management. And of course, as soon as we are talking about this area of work, we're talking about the interaction of weeds, soil fertility, and soil carbon. It's hard to not talk about all three of them at the same time. The more we disturb the soil with frequent tillage, and the deeper that tillage is, the more we're releasing carbon into the atmosphere, and we're degrading our soil organic matter. But we also use practices such as green manure crops to build our soil organic matter. But then comes the question of weed management, and how do we manage our weeds when if we're trying to minimize tillage. So I'm going to start just with a slide that relating to weed management. Then I'm going to go into green manures and cover crops and some of the research that's been happening. And a lot of the weed management research has been happening in association with Dr. Shurtleff and Eric Johnson, as well as with Martin Entz and Miriam Fernandez. And then more of the green manure and cropping systems work is Dr. Entz and Fernandez. But I'm providing a synthesis, so an overview of all of these different research projects and kind of a collection of key outcomes or findings. And you might have heard some of these things already from these researchers as they've been presenting their results for a while. So here's this first slide is some work that's happened out of Dr. Shurtleff's lab at the University of Saskatchewan. And I think it's really valuable to reinforce and promote how rotary hose and to some extent tine weeders are minimal disturbance weed control options. And of course, they don't always work in all conditions, but they can provide a very good alternative to weed control. And rotary hose can also be used in fields that have a fair bit of residue left on them, and they won't bury the residue. So the latest introduction of mechanical weed control in terms of inter-row tillage is also very interesting. And we're seeing Dr. Shurtleff is doing some of this work, as well as Dr. Entz and others across the country. But we're seeing some very interesting results coming out of that as well. So we're definitely seeing that the rotary hoe, and this research was done with lentils and peas, and the rotary hoe can be very effective in controlling a large proportion of the weed population, when it's coupled with a higher seeding rate. so you have that higher competition. And then if you want to even have further weed control, then you do the inter-row tillage. So it's a combination of practices that results in your best weed management. And that integrated approach to weed management is really important. Okay, so next I'm going to get into green manures and soil health a little bit here, and this whole connection between these different components of the organic cropping system. And I think what's important here is to understand that we cannot be draining our soils. And sometimes, and we've got research now that's clearly demonstrated that we cannot be abusive in our organic farming systems, that just taking advantage of the background soil fertility will eventually result in it being drained. And so that's one thing that we've learned from a variety of the research projects. Another one is that, and this is touched on very nicely in Chris Trump's presentation and other presenters as well, is that we need to support the soil biology. That if we want to have healthy biology, we need to have biomass that is going into the soil and that is feeding that biology. And we want to have the right kinds of biomass that are going there, and a diversity to support a diversity in microbiology. A lot of our nutrients in organic systems are coming from the cycling of organic matter. So if we're removing residue, or if we are not incorporating residue into the soil, then there's going to be very slow nutrient turnover. Or if you have very low biomass producing crops year after year, you're not going to be feeding the soil, you will not get nutrient turnover, and you'll end up with lower yields. And so it's really important that we ensure that we're maintaining that soil health by feeding the soil. And you can do that by adding compost and manure to the soil. And it's really interesting. Actually, Dr. Entz is probably going to talk more about carbon and soil health in his presentation tomorrow. And there's another research activity that's being led by Dr. Lemke and a whole bunch of other people from Ag Canada and the University of Manitoba, looking at integrated soil health and fertility management. So I encourage you to tune in tomorrow and capture that presentation. Okay, so let's get further into these reduced tillage systems. And we're trying again to reduce our tillage. That's one of our goals, to prevent degradation of the soil and mimic more natural ecosystems. And so some of these reduced tillage systems have definitely proven to be effective in terms of reducing the depletion of the destruction of the soil structure, so aggregates in the soil. And they have also been instrumental in reducing erosion potential. So you're improving some soil structural characteristics and probably adding some organic matter to the soil, which is great. However, a number of the studies that have been conducted by Dr. Fernandez and Dr. Entz and Dr. Shurtleff, they have demonstrated that perennial weeds can become a problem in these low or reduced tillage systems. And so the key message here is that you might be able to go no-till for a couple of years, but you definitely should be cautious if you already have a perennial weed problem on your fields. And it might not be the best option for you in that case. And you need to come back to doing some tillage every now and then to control those problem perennials. But I find the no-till farming system, organic systems, fascinating in terms of the potential. And we've moved away from just using fall rye as our cover crop for no-till management. And we've recognized that we need to have fertility in there as well. So, but ultimately we need to create a good solid mulch. If you have kind of a weak mulch of organic matter on the soil surface, then you will not get good enough control of your annual weeds. And so you have to have enough biomass there that will actually suppress the weeds. So roller crimping and mowing are reasonable alternatives, so the research has shown, but you need to have a mulch on the soil surface of around 6 to 7.6 tons per hectare in order to control weeds. So that means you have to have a pretty good thick layer of mulch there. So how do you get that? You have to have enough fertility to actually generate that biomass. And hairy vetch barley mixes have actually been proven to have really good success in terms of generating that biomass and preventing annual weeds from becoming a problem. We also sometimes might run into some issues with annual weeds, and so again, this is where going in with a rotary hoe could be useful to help control those annual weeds. In terms of terminating the annual weeds, of course, one of the issues is how do we get those, terminating the cover crops. We want to get the nutrients from the cover crops into supporting the next cash crop that you're growing. And a lot of the research, and this is one of the downsides of the reduced tillage or no-till farming systems, is that generally speaking, there's been lower nutrient supply from a lot of these different cover crops, especially nitrogen, in the following cash crops. And so you might not get the same yield as you would if you were tilling those cover crops in. That's relating to the delayed decomposition of the organic matter. However, the upside is that delayed decomposition of organic matter also means that there's less nitrate in the soil in the fall, which is susceptible to leaching, so you don't lose it. Some interesting research that was also done at the University of Manitoba by Harun Sisek was looking at grazing of the green manures, and he found that up to 80% of the nutrients that were grazed will stay in the field. So you can receive some income from that cover crop. It can help with terminating it, but you can also harvest some livestock off of it at the same time. One of the key results in terms of the types of a lot of different cover crops will provide different nutrient profiles and will decompose at different rates. And one thing that's clear is that cereal crops will decompose the most slowly and will tie up more nitrogen. That's been well recognized for decades. But oilseed radish or radish crops will decompose very quickly and will lose their nutrients the most rapidly. And of course, we want to have legumes in the mix to support yields in the following crops. So let's take a look at these legumes. And in short, the hairy vetch barley mix seems to be the one that is providing the most nutrients. And they can produce a whopping 300 or 300 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen, and which is just huge. You know, it's fascinating to see. However, a lot of that nitrogen can actually be released over the winter, and that's not good news. However, overall, we're seeing that a hairy vetch barley roll down will support and maintain a pretty good yield of wheat in the following years, at least in these trials in Manitoba, and actually comparable to conventional average yields. So you get the mulching for weed control, and you get the nitrogen from the vetch, and you get some decent crops. Okay, I need to move along. Just a couple of examples of other research that are going on in Ontario, or one project in Ontario that's also looking at legume cover cropping and corn and soybean rotation systems. And so here is a slide showing some of their results. You can see the conventional corn in the top left, the organic corn in the bottom left, and then you have the corn that's grown with cover crop, hairy vetch, red clover, and crimson clover. And you can see that the corn is doing quite well, that those cover crops are providing a lot of nitrogen to the corn. And corn is a heavy feeder. It needs a lot of nutrients. So when you look at the little graph there on the side, you can see that the apparent nitrogen recovery of the corn crop is in the order of 150 kilograms per hectare for hairy vetch. And then and crimson clover and red clover are not far behind. Okay, so further into soil fertility, phosphorus is definitely one of the issues that we have in organic production systems. We can't easily add it. We don't have a good source of phosphorus that we can apply to the soil. And we're also really interested in recycling. So of course, compost and manure is very helpful for adding phosphorus. But we're also exploring research into struvite through Joanne Thiessen-Martin's work out at the University of Manitoba, along with her colleagues at Ag Canada and the University of Guelph. And they're looking at struvite, which is basically taking waste, sewage waste, and also it can be manure waste, and extracting the phosphorus from that and creating pelletized phosphorus sources. And this work is being supported by Austera, and who have products available, and we're testing their effectiveness in organic management systems. And it's a really interesting one that we've also been talking about in the National Standards Committee as to whether or not this should be accepted. And so interesting discussions there. So this research is really forward thinking, and it's looking at recycling of waste, which is really great. One last slide on weed control, and I found this one was really interesting. This comes from Organic Science Cluster 2, and this research was being done in Quebec, and it was looking at using Indian mustard as a biofumigant to help control of annual weeds. And they actually found that it did suppress the annual weeds within the mustard crop, and then also in the following crop in the following spring. And this might be, now, again, we're trying to increase nitrogen supply when we're growing cover crops, so it might not be effective that way. But some farmers are also dealing with wireworm issues, and Indian mustard, along with buckwheat, is being explored in PEI as potentially helping to suppress wireworms, although there's definitely more interest in buckwheat in that regard. Anyway, very interesting that we're, I always kind of wonder, is the concept of biofumigation even something that we want to explore in organic systems? I'd love to hear your perspectives on that, but nevertheless, it's a way of controlling weeds in a biological way that is fairly novel. Another piece of really interesting research that's happening in Ontario is at the University of Guelph, is this research by Dr. Manish Rezada. And he's looking at Fusarium head blight in wheat. And of course, we do have this problem pretty much right across the country. We aren't using fungicides in organic systems. We can select some cultivars that are more resistant, but this research is really cool because what it's basically, wherever there's a disease or insect pest even, usually there's some sort of predator of those diseases or insects that are available in the natural environment. So Dr. Rezada and his team are looking at the wheat head, and they're actually taking samples of the microbiology that's on the stem within the wheat head to see what kind of microorganisms are in the wheat head. Never even thought of that myself. And so really fascinating work. And what he's finding is that there are lines of bacteria that are growing within the heads of wheat and that are actually suppressing Fusarium head blight. And which you might notice if you're growing your crop, some heads are affected more than others, and some might not be affected at all. And this might be the explanation for it. So in other words, he's developing a biological type control for managing Fusarium head blight by selecting an organism that actually helps to inhibit that blight. So really, really cool research. I'm excited to see where this goes. So lots of interesting research. That's the research that's happening in relation to cereals. Most recently, there's more projects that are happening that I didn't cover. If you look at activity 7 in the Organic Science Cluster 3 brochure, you'll see that Dr. Shurtleff is working on supporting that organic oat breeding program by developing better agronomic practices for managing oats. And he also, and then we have activity 8, which is the soil health project and looking at ways of maintaining and enhancing soil fertility and soil carbon. So really big projects there, as well as research that's going on down with Dr. Fernandez at Swift Current. So we want this research to have impact, and we want it to get out there. So we do have a Science Cluster webpage. And so you can come to our website, dal.ca/OACC/OSCII. That's on the bottom of the Organic Science Cluster 3 brochure as well. in case you forget, but you can probably search it pretty quickly, or email me. I love hearing from people from the prairies. So we're producing lots of materials, including podcasts and magazines. I actually have a magazine here. We're working on our next magazine, which will be coming out this spring, and that's covering the science of organic agriculture. So I encourage you to sign up for that. Again, I want to acknowledge our partners in the Organic Science Cluster 3 program. These are the ones, again, that are supporting the grains work. If you look into the brochures, you'll see all of the other partners that are supporting the many other research activities that are happening as well. One thing that I want to tell you that we're looking into the future here as well. And I was really inspired by Bob Quinn's presentation this morning, where he said that they had supported 15 years of research that produced over 30 scientific publications. And it's a great example of industry working with scientists to establish research priorities and support research programs. We need to start planning and preparing for the next round of organic science clusters, which will be happening in a couple of years. But we actually start the process next year, where we'll be starting to identify research needs and priorities. We need to hear from you as the producers. What are the priorities that you want to pursue in organic research? We need to better understand how our crops are interacting within that natural environment and how we can optimize those conditions. So what are the priorities? Is it weed management, soil fertility management? Is it climate change, biodiversity, supporting biodiversity? Lots of interesting topics we can pursue. And so I'm looking forward for that input. And also we need to have industry partners supporting this. So you can encourage those industry partners or people that you buy products from or sell to get involved and talk with them about identifying what are really important priorities for research. And that can help us work towards our next science cluster program, which not only supports the research, but also future professionals in organic as well, and builds that capacity to give you knowledge that's being generated from Canada. So encourage you to get involved and also talk to your commodity groups who you're selling to. You saw that we have a bunch of the commodity organizations already supporting our Organic Science Cluster 3. Encourage them to support our Organic Science Cluster work in the future as well. So I'd like to acknowledge the crew that works on the Organic Science Cluster program. Nicole Boudreau, who some of you might recognize with the white shirt in the center, is working with the Organic Federation of Canada, and she's the cluster manager. And the Federation is the lead applicant of the science cluster, so we're very grateful to have that partnership with the Organic Federation. And then we have Margaret Graves, who's our program manager, and Emma Geldart, our communications officer, and Misty Rennie, who keeps the wheels turning in the office. So very grateful for their support. So that's my presentation, and I rambled through pretty quickly, but I think we have some time for some questions. Back to you, Marla.
Yeah, absolutely, we do. Thank you so much, Andy. That was really good. I think it is that kind of age-old challenge and opportunity of extending the research in a way that's usable for farmers. And what I found really interesting and great about today is it did some of that hard work of summarizing a lot of the research findings and talking about how it can be applied on the farm, which I think is super helpful. I do have a question, and the question is, have you been approached with respect to research on growing of organic faba beans in Alberta or Saskatchewan in particular?
Not too much. I would say that we had some discussions around organic faba bean in, it's probably at least 10 years ago, when I think Dr. King was doing some work at the University of Alberta in relation to some pulses. And now you could be talking about either faba bean as a green manure or as a seed crop. I'm not sure which way the question wants to go. At that time, it was that research was more directed towards harvesting it as a seed. But there has been a little bit of work relating to using it as a roll down or terminating it as a green manure crop as well. And I think if you have good for moisture, you could probably get a pretty good plow down of faba bean as a green manure. But interesting project if we want to explore that. Yeah, but I haven't been approached lately.
Yeah, okay, for sure. And there was just a follow-up. The questioner was interested in the seed crop, but I think you've answered sort of both applications or uses for organic faba beans. And then I had a comment that I want to share because it's I think it well definitely reflects how I always experience your presentations, that they're very informative and presented in a way that's understandable, and sometimes that isn't always the case. When we receive sort of information about various science projects. So thank you so much for that. And you know, I always think it's great if you learn at least one thing from a presentation today. And although I learned many, the one that I learned for sure was that they're about AAC tradition, and that is a wheat cultivar bred under organic conditions. So I will definitely be doing my bit to promote that. So,
sounds great.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's really tough, you know, there's so many amazing research projects that have been happening in the science clusters over the last 3 clusters. And, you know, in 45 minutes, you can't do them all credit, but it's about creating awareness. And we are trying to produce more of these types of resources that people can go to actually see those results being summarized. And like the tech bulletin on the breeding really, I think, describes the research that's been happening in breeding pretty well. So, but we're looking forward to doing more of that, and we'll soon be embarking on Science Cluster 4. I really encourage people to talk with, I think, Marla, you said that you're going to start doing research prioritization soon as well?
That is definitely something that our research committee has done. We've produced 2 reports, which are available at our website if folks would like to have a look at those, saskaorganics.org. But yeah, that is definitely something that farmers really participate in, right? So they, you know, they're definitely interested in you know, contributing to that prioritization process. So definitely let's have a conversation about how we, you know, how we work within the kind of the timeline or the framework of the national prioritization process. And I did have one more question for you. So you mentioned that you could sign up for the magazine. Did I hear that right? And if so, where do we go to your website, or how do we do that?
Yes, if you go to our website, the homepage should have, you can go to our organic e-zine, but you don't, you can even pop me an email and I'll get you signed up if that's easiest. But you can go to our organics on the OACC website. There's an Organic Science Clusters tab. If you click on Clusters 3, there is a list or a tab that shows all of the latest research and news associated with the cluster. So it's a nice way to go to find out all the latest stuff coming out of the cluster, and all of the bulletins and the magazines are there for Cluster 3.
Okay. No, that's great, and it's also given me some ideas about how Sask Organics and Organic Connections can work with you to you know, to get the information out to farmers on the prairies. Just you know, similar to what you did in your presentation today, but also just reminding, you know, because it's that we need to, you know, we all need to be reminded a few times about, you know, where the resources live and how we can access them. So we can maybe have a conversation about how we could best help out with that.
Yeah, we're developing a promotion plan to better make people aware of that. So yeah, look forward to working with you, Marla, always.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you.
And Carla as well. They were great. So.
Oh, I know. They should probably pop their cameras on, but you know, I'll leave that up to them. But for those of you who don't know, Carla Borsa is the event coordinator for Organic Connections, and Deb Tuchelt is working with Organic Connections as well on this on the conference, and she also works for Sask Organics as our programs coordinator. So thank you again to Carla and Deb, and also to the Organic Connections Board of Directors. A shout out to them as well for their their work on making all of this happen. So that's led me into saying goodbye for today. So thank you again, Andy. Thank you to all of our speakers today. It's been a full and rich conversation, and lots of diverse information. But as things always seem to have, and it's kind of like a potluck, you know, you go and it always seems to work out, that it all seems to go together, and there's connections between the two that you might not have even seen when you started to plan the agenda. So thank you all for being a part of today. We really appreciate it. And again, thank you to our sponsors. We cannot do it without you. Our gold sponsors, Back to Your Roots, EcoCert, Fresh Hemp Foods, FW Cobbs, Grain Millers, ProCert, Organic, PHS Organics, TCO Cert, Sunrise International, and Stonehenge Global Seeds, Inc. And our silver sponsors, Blue Sky Hemp Ventures, BioFert, Roquette, and our bronze sponsors, EcoT, Farm Credit Canada, HGI, Hemp Genetics, Mums